Stranger Things stories. Who is Vecna? Thieves making magic. Modern ventures. Why we'll always love dice. The video game link. The many partnerships. Healing words, therapy, and play. The magic of D&D can save us. And draconic measures. Now I'm, of course, really interested in the healing words section. Beneath the city of Waterdeep, a beholder crime lord known as Xanathar believes it can gather information on everything in the multiverse. Water dragons live in mountain vales or icy caves. Their breath weapon is a rigid blast of cold damage. The storied roots. While Dungeons & Dragons has had an influence on modern-day fantasy, its own inspirations lie in the pulp fiction of the early 20th century by Michael Whitwer. On March 5th, 2008, Emmy Award-winning television host and comedian Stephen Colbert closed his hit spoof news show, The Colbert Report, on an uncharacteristically somber note. Before we go, nation, I have some sad news. Yesterday, Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons & Dragons, passed away at age 69. Gary, you will be missed. How much will you be missed? Colbert asked in his signature-type band. To the laugh of the studio audience, he revealed and rolled a 20-sided die. 20. May your prismatic spray always bypass your target's reflex saving throw. It was an odd tribute, even for a fake news show that spent most of its time making light of mainstream topics and events. By 2008, D&D was far from mainstream, but what the longtime D&D fan and future late show host knew was that D&D was relevant, and the death of its co-creator was big news. And Colbert wasn't alone. There had been passing references on TV shows here, loving references in major MMOs, or computer role-playing games there. Colbert and the creators behind these innovations all knew something that it took the rest of the world a bit longer to see. D&D, and Gygax by extension, had changed the world. Over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it had fundamentally shifted how people created and interacted with fantasy. It was a training ground for the imagination, growing and cultivating a generation of computer programmers, content creators, and game designers who would go on to build the infrastructure of the information age. An estimated 50 million people have played the game. Millions more watch others play on Twitch and YouTube. D&D books and video games regularly top bestseller lists. D&D-inspired TV shows swarm the streaming services, and a recent D&D movie even won the box office. The last decade or so has been kind to the game, and upon D&D's 50th anniversary, it's hardly a secret anymore, which is all the more remarkable given its humble, strange origins. Published in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in 1974, Dungeons & Dragons was the world's first role-playing game, created by small-town shoe repairman Gary Gygax and college history major Dave Arneson. The pioneering rule set was a strange amalgam of disparate tabletop horror and the strategy games of the day, read, and narrated by a non-player called the Dungeon Master, or DM, in D&D dexterity. When it's time to try something that requires some real skill, like attacking a goblin, success is determined by a combination of your character's quantifiable talent and a roll of the dice. Using these means to adjudicate and resolve the action, the Dungeon Master guides a group of adventurers through dungeons and along generally preconceived storylines that only the DM knows. These elements may sound obvious today, but they were certainly not in 1974. Called the most influential game by John Romero, co-creator of the seminal first-person shooter game Doom, D&D would pioneer a slew of now ubiquitous gaming concepts. If you've ever lost hit points in a video game or leveled up in a retail rewards program, you have D&D to thank. That is to say, even if you don't play a D&D, you still play D&D. Here we have a illustration on the opposite page. Like J.R.R. Tolkien's Elves, the Elves of Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition did not die of old age. Instead, they migrated to another land. It also introduced concepts around dungeon crawling and cooperative gameplay that have become mainstays in role-playing, board, and video games design ever since. But what made make the game unique? Not coincidentally, the word appears in the name of the gaming genre that D&D pioneered. Role-playing is the action of gamified role assumption. In D&D, you play a role. That is, each individual assumes one or more specific characters they play, declaring actions for and even speaking for their characters. This dynamic of player and dungeon master interaction creates something akin to group storytelling, a story in which no one, not even the dungeon master, knows exactly what will happen. Story. Without it, there is no D&D, and if story is at the heart of the game, what kind of stories might you tell? Perhaps just as important, what kind of stories inspired this strange game in the first place? The answer to that question lies in the speculative fiction of the early 20th century. Stranger than pulp fiction. Fantasy, science fiction. Today, these terms conjure visions of blockbuster movie franchises, AAA video games, and some of the top series on television, from brands like Marvel and Star Wars to Harry Potter and Star Trek. this day, pulps not only traded in mainline adventure detective and western stories, but found homes for the wild, fantastical, and weird emerging genres of fantasy, science fiction, and horror. Publications of the amazing stories, unknown and weird tales found a healthy niche fan base alongside the more mainstream and less racy pulps like Argosy and Blue Book. D&D had changed the world over the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It fundamentally shifted how people created and interacted with fantasy. Young writers with big ideas and little to lose, such as H.P. Lovecraft, the Cthulhu series, Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian series, and Fritz Leiber, Fafard, and the Grey Mouser series, would find a regular paycheck in the churn of writing for the pulps. The stories were exciting and ephemeral. What evil sorcerer might Conan the Barbarian take on in the next month's issue of Weird Tales? What sort of mischief would Fafard and the Grey Mouser be up to in the upcoming volume of Unknown? Meanwhile, across the pond, another fantasy movement was brewing. This one rooted in decidedly higher ideals than those of its North American counterpart. In 1937, heavily inspired by European mythology and fairy tales, an Oxford professor of philology named J.R.R. Tolkien would publish a juvenile novel called The Hobbit, a story set in a beautiful, dangerous world called Middle-earth. Tolkien tells of a diminutive hero thrust into an unexpected journey, fraught with mystical creatures, wise wizards, deadly monsters, and lost treasures. It was definitive high fantasy as we understand it today. The obsessive Tolkien carried on and continued developing his inspiring stories of Middle-earth, finally completing and publishing his magnum opus, The Lord of the Rings trilogy, over 1954 and 1955. But those expensive hardcovers would only find modest distribution and sales in Great Britain and the US, following the same trend of the pulps, which were very much on the decline. By the mid-1950s, due to the rise of competing entertainment such as television, digest magazines, and comic books. By that time, most of the one-and-done stories from the pulps were lost to obscurity. Only a few remained in print due to the efforts of committed editors and writers such as L. Sprague, De Camp, and Lynn Carter, who preserved them through small press anthologies. Meanwhile, a budding group of fantasy science fiction authors who had emerged from the pulp tradition, such as Jack Vance, Dying Earth series, Paul Powell Anderson, Three Hearts and Three Lions, Michael Moorcock, Elric of Milnavona series, inched the genre forward with their pulp-style fantasy novels of the 50s and 60s. But then something remarkable happened, and all because of a lost ring. In 1965, a U.S. publisher produced a series of dirt-cheap, unlicensed paperbacks of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which somehow found the right market at the right time and about price point. Sales exploded, bringing these formerly obscure works to the mainstream and dragging with them any other type of fantasy that existed in mass-market form, including fantasy anthologies that rescued beloved pulp stories from oblivion. A fantasy craze had become, and two Midwestern wargamers who had grown up with the pulps took notice. Now here we have the 20-sided die is the most important die in D&D used for attack rolls since the early entries of the game. D&D 3rd Edition's rule set is referred to as the D20 system because it integrated the die into more core mechanics. We have some really pretty sets of dice here. We got like a purple and bluey one, green with some black stripes through it, a mottled red and black. It almost looks like the blue shimmery one that's on the cover. rules to play. Wargaming during the 1960s was an esoteric hobby practiced by a small and disparate community of mostly young people scattered across the country. Some purchased board war games such as Avalon Hills, Gettysburg, 1958, while others could be played with a variety of miniatures on a table with homemade terrain that emulates a battlefield, with a focus on replaying and simulating famous battles, such as those of Napoleon, the American Civil War, or World War II. Accuracy was paramount. There wasn't much room for the fantastical. In 1969, a pulp fantasy enthusiast and passionate wargamer named Gary Gygax observed, "There is a great interest in war games of ancient and medieval times, but few games are published." He subsequently partnered with a local wargamer named Jeff Barron and made one himself called Chainmail. Published in 1971, Chainmail was a 60-page digest-sized booklet of miniature wargame rules that sought to interest the wargamer sufficiently to start him on the pursuit of medieval history. But with 20 years of fantasy spinning round in his head, from the pulp stylings of Robert E. Howard to the new and readily accessible craze led by the works of Tolkien, Moorcock, Anderson, Gygax landed on a wild idea. He would add a section at the end of the rule set called the Fantasy Supplement, because most of the fantastic battles related in novels more closely resemble medieval warfare than they do earlier or later forms of combat. The 14-page supplement goes on to promise that these rules allow players to refight the epic struggles related by J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, and other fantasy writers, and the game included rules to play with Tolkien-esque creatures such as hobbits, ents, and balrogs. You could even play with a single entity, higher power units called wizards, heroes, and superheroes, the last term swiped from the popular Marvel and DC comics of the day. With this, the fantasy game was born. Gygax's Chainmail would especially intrigue one of his wargaming acquaintances, a University of Minnesota history student named Dave Arneson. Arneson and his Twin Cities gaming group had been experimenting with all manner of war and strategy games, some of which included a degree of role assumption, which including creating and acting as your own singular character. In Greek mythology, the Tharnian Hydra was a 9-headed, poisonous, water snake-like monster. The D&D iteration may have up to 50 heads in rare cases. These are interesting illustrations. I wonder who they're by. There's no credit on the pages themselves. Now, the use of miniatures in Dungeons & Dragons has always been optional. Players can also use ad hoc pieces like bottle caps or spare dice to illustrate battle positioning. When Arneson got hold of Chainmail, he found a rule set that featured fantasy archetypes and combat mechanics he could use for a fantasy scenario he had been planning for his group, called Blackmoor. According to Arneson, he had been reading a Conan book that day before he ran his first Blackmoor session. No doubt an inspiration for the dank dungeons beneath Castle Blackmoor. When Gygax heard reports of this alluring new fantasy dungeon game being played in the Twin Cities, he asked to see whatever rules Arneson had developed. A brief demo some months later led to a collaboration between the two on a new type of game, one that would come to be called Dungeons & Dragons. When D&D was published in 1974, the pulpy fingerprints of Weird Tales and other mid-century fantasy were all over it. A cooperative but diverse set of adventures, setting out to save a mystical world full of elves, dwarves, goblins, and dragons. A check for Tolkien. A ragtag group of scallywags out for treasure and fame. A check for labor. A grotesque collection of otherworldly creatures and monsters to battle, a check for Lovecraft. A system of magic where spells are erased from the user's memory once cast, a check for Vance. Holy warriors, whose abilities of healing and protection are powered by faith, a check for Anderson. A brutal and uncaring world where magic is rare and unnatural, and the golden rules kill or be killed, a check for Howard. Pulp Fiction delivered a visceral, immersive narrative of fantastic adventure. As games historian author John Peterson puts it, these were stories that demanded more than just to be read. Fans wanted to experience these adventures themselves. Finally, in 1974, D&D provided a technology that made that possible. And that technology, whether instantiated or on a tabletop or desktop, has been a dominant force in popular culture ever since. Despite trading among the most ephemeral fiction of the day, the pulp and fantasy authors of the early and mid-20th century would go on to leave an indelible mark upon D&D. Gygax would make the connection entirely unambiguous in the game's foreword. These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures where John Carter is groping through black pits, who feel no thrill upon reading Howard's Conan saga, who do not enjoy the camp and Brett fantasies, or Fritz Leiber's Favard and the Grey Mouser. Pitting their swords against evil sorceries will not be likely to find Dungeons and Dragons to their taste, but those whose imaginations know no bounds will find these rules are the answer to their prayers. The D&D Fantasy Bridge. Today, the influence of Dungeons and Dragons upon not just writers, but pretty much all contemporary content creators cannot be overstated. Why? Because D&D is everywhere, and whether or not someone happens to play D&D or one of its many role-playing game descendants or derivatives, they are still experiencing D&D in some form everywhere they go. It's impossible to engage in just about any digital game or even social media without touching an element that was once unique to D&D. Fantasy fiction, movies, and television rely heavily on the detailed taxonomy of fantasy monsters, classes, and cultures that D&D brought to the forefront through the game. Whether a core thematic element of Stranger Things, the inspiration for a best-selling novel, or even a dreaming actual play show like Critical Role, where we watch a group of gamers create a story before our very eyes, some of which have gone on to be adapted into other forms of content, such as with Amazon's The Legend of Vox Machina. D&D's Sooted Fingerprints are all over contemporary content everywhere. National Book Award winner Ta-Nehisi Coates suggests that the game introduced him to the powers of imagination. A-list director John Favreau agrees, positing that D&D gave him a really strong background in imagination, storytelling, understanding how to create tone, and a sense of balance. Both the Star Wars and Marvel franchises owe him thanks, and D&D by extension. The unique interactive game mechanics of D&D not only allow players to be part of the story, but demand that they participate in building it. In other words, you don't just play D&D, you create it. It's no wonder that so many of the leading creatives and innovators of the information age cite the game as such a formative influence, and why its concepts are so ubiquitous today. No matter how the next 50 years go for the Dungeons & Dragons brand, its legacy is secure as an inescapable influence on the creators of tomorrow. Michael Whitwer is a New York Times best-selling author who writes books about Dungeons, Dragons, and fantasy novels, including the Hugo Award-nominated Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana. And here we have, named for author H.P. Lovecraft, Lovecraftian or Eldritch horror is a seven evangelical theologians, George Grant and Peter Leithart, published a 17-page book called A Christian Response to Dungeons and Dragons, the Catechism of the New Age. The cover featured an illustration of an evil-looking dragon clutching one child in his fist while reaching menacingly toward another. The authors claimed that, among other evils, Dungeons and Dragons promoted witchcraft, devil worship, and magic that was, of course, corrupting the minds of America's Christian youth. Dungeons and Dragons is a dangerous game. It serves as an introduction to evil, Catechism of Occultism primer for the ABCs of the New Age. It is a recursion tool for Satan, read the conclusion, but despite Grant and Leithart's warnings, D&D popularity continued to grow and grow and grow until its themes didn't even seem particularly extreme or unconventional after all. Now, 50 years after its creation, D&D is no longer a niche hobby, feared by those who don't understand it. Instead, it is a quintessential part of pop culture, with an estimated 50 million players globally, and a Christian response to Dungeons and Dragons has a 2.3-star rating on Goodreads. Chainmail and White Box Edition. In the 60s and 70s, Gary Gygax was part of a small but passionate community of tabletop wargamers in the Midwest. An insurance underwriter, Jehovah's Witness, and father of 5, Gygax would meet with his friends during his free time to clash giant armies of miniature figurines in the large-scale battles. Maneuvers were determined by rolling dice, and one player would serve as a judge to help settle disputes, which were typically related to minute historical details of World War II, the Civil War, or whatever other military era the group was in at the moment. It was kind of stodgy and historically focused, and the people that were into this were super serious, says Joe Peterson, a role-playing game historian and author of Playing at the World, who explains that the majority of the wargaming community was white and male. I would say it was typically conservative, especially against the backdrop of 60s counterculture, he adds. Over 5 decades, the franchise has reinvented and rewritten itself to appeal to a wider audience and keep players engaged. Because it was such a niche hobby, the rules to these war games was not really established, so players formed governing societies at both the national and local level, and published rules and supplements in amateur newsletters and fanzines that were disseminated throughout the community. Gygax particularly loved tweaking rules and creating supplemental guides, and he even teased other wargamers who were too married to the rules. They'd write in and ask the publisher of the game what to do. Whatever they were told, they did, and I said, "That's silly, just make it up," he said in the 2000 interview with Wired. In 1970, Gygax lost his job at the insurance company and started working as a cobbler. "We were desperately poor. My mom would garden to put food on the table and make bread as opposed to buying bread. All those things to try to save money," says Gygax's son, Luke. Trying to make ends meet, Gygax took a stab at the game designing professionally. By that time, he had become fascinated by medieval warfare, like his friend Jeff Barron, a fellow member of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. Barron had drafted some rules for the new game that Gygax expanded and dubbed Chainmail. In Chainmail, a single miniature represented one character or hero, as opposed to an entire military unit, as was typical in most war games. And supplemental set of rules. biggest hit, selling around 100 copies per month. Excited by the idea that game designing could be his full-time job, Gygax had also been collaborating with Minnesota-based wargamer and Castle and Crusade Society member Dave Arneson, who, on another game called Don't Give Up the Ship. The two had met at Gen Con, a gaming convention hosted by Gygax in 1969, and bonded over their interest in Napoleonic-era naval warfare. Don't Give Up the Ship players use dice, rulers, and protractors to determine moves, pushing large fleets of model sailing ships across the floor. The game was ultimately published by Guidon Games a year after Chainmail, and he had been incorporating the rules, especially the elements from the fantasy supplement, into his own long-running campaign called Blackmoor. Unlike the other wargaming campaigns of the time, Blackmoor campaign was far less concerned with historical accuracy, and players didn't always stick to the rule books. As the leader of that game, Arneson also took on a role far more involved than that of the simple referee. He would set a scene with detailed descriptions of the monsters and other fantastical beings as the players descended into a 6th-floor dungeon he dreamed of. A dungeon is a nice, self-contained, he told Wired in 2008. Players can't go romping out over the countryside, and you can control the situation. It was in Blackmoor where the idea of dungeon adventuring was born. You would have to explore, and you would have to draw maps so you wouldn't get lost as you went through it, explained Peterson. When Gygax heard about the campaign, he reached out to see if he could incorporate some of the rules into a chainmail supplement. Arneson and his crew ended up driving down to Lake Geneva to play with Gygax. They encountered a troll with magic armor during that game, and that's when Gygax understood just how incredible Arneson's ideas really were. Gary realized this was a much bigger idea than just something that was going to tack on to a new expansion to Chainmail, and that is when the work towards Dungeons & Dragons commenced, said Peterson, who explained that Dungeons & Dragons was really a combination of two groups, the wargaming community that Gygax and Arneson were a part of, and the fantasy and sci-fi fandoms that also existed at the time. They started experimenting, as a number of people were at the time, with how you could simulate a fantastic world and fantastic people. He says Guidon Games was not interested in role-playing, so Gygax ended up breaking off from the company in 1973. You can now tour Gygax's home in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, above. Though the game was developed in his home, Gygax, opposite left, worked at the TSR offices circa 1983, opposite right, Gygax, with, from left, Peter Adkison, founder of Wizards of the Coast, and Richard Garfield, inventor of Magic the Gathering. Right here. Over a period of several months, Gygax and Arneson sent rules and ideas back and forth by mail, and tension started brewing. Arneson was definitely an idea guy, whereas Gygax was somebody who understood how to build consensus around sets of rules, socialize them, and get them into a form other people at least had a chance of understanding, says Peterson. Gygax wanted a rule for every situation, while Arneson wanted it to be more free-form, allowing people to use their imagination, like he had during Blackmoor campaigns. But despite some creative differences, D&D started coming together. In the first official test game, Gygax gathered two of his children, his childhood friend Don Kay, and another neighborhood kid. Gygax instructed each player to pick a character. He gave them a card with a list of attributes and had them roll a 6-sided die to determine how much of each attribute their character had. Then he let them down into the dungeon, which was full of unexpected treasure and monsters, and had them make choices in line with their character's attributes. Role-playing isn't storytelling. If the dungeon master is directing it, it's not. Gygax then began brainstorming names, and when Dungeons & Dragons received the seal of approval from his 4-year-old daughter, it was settled. But Gygax and Arneson hit another roadblock when they tried to find a gaming company to publish it. The companies turned a profit by selling miniature gaming pieces. D&D only required dice and a pen and paper. They didn't see how they could profit solely from a rulebook. Undeterred, Gygax partnered with Kay to launch his own publishing company, Tactical Studies Rules, TSR. Notably, he didn't include Arneson in the company, saying he wasn't much of a business person. They scraped together some money and assembled the rulebook by hand in Gygax's basement and printed 1,000 copies, a small fraction of the 50,000 copies Gygax said they could sell when pitching the game to Avalon Hill, then the biggest war game publisher. In 1974, D&D officially hit the market. It took about 10 months for the first printing to sell out, but the second printing started taking off, and soon Gygax was receiving calls 24 hours a day from players around the company, quizzing him on the rules or asking him to dungeon master over the phone. Luke Gygax, a military veteran and game designer, recalls attending conventions with his father where people would ask for his autograph. It was very apparent he was a well-respected game designer and figure in the community, which he enjoyed, not in a pompous way. He would always talk with people. He loved to chat with gamers and hear their ideas, says Luke, who explains that gamers would often approach his father with their own ideas for games, and Gygax would almost always write to them with notes and suggestions. He came up in a very small community where everyone tries to help each other, Luke says. In the press, in late 1977, TSR received a letter from the licensing company that controlled some of the rights to writer J.R.R. Tolkien's intellectual property. It posed objections to TSR using certain mythical creatures such as Hobbit, Balrog, and Ent, saying they infringed on copyright. Interestingly, Gygax was not a fan of Tolkien's work. It was so dull. I mean, there was no action in it. I'd like to throttle Frodo, he told Wired in 2007. It was ultimately decided that ideas, including dragons and goblins, were public domain, but Hobbits, Ents, and Balrogs became halflings, Trance, and Balor. Tension had also been brewing between Arneson and Gygax as creative differences continued to spark conflict. TSR ultimately did hire Arneson to work for the company, but he was unhappy with his position. By the time Arneson got down to Lake Geneva in 1976, he already felt like he wasn't able to contribute to the work in a way that was ongoing in the system, says Peterson. By 1976, Arneson was out, but that was only the beginning of the feud. Just a year later, TSR published 2 new versions of the game, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, AD&D, and Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set. While Arneson had been receiving 5% in royalties from TSR, Gygax argued that this new version was different enough that he was no longer entitled. Arneson sued, and in 1981 the case was settled with Arneson receiving 2.5% on certain AD&D titles. AD&D expanded and refined the rules set forth in the original version of the game, making them much clearer. Some intellectual property was reworked to avoid copyright issues, including opposite top, Balor's, Trance, halflings, opposite bottom, tabletop figurines at Geneva Lake Museum. Top, Dr. Joyce Brothers defended D&D on a Toronto radio station, and above, teens played the game in 1991. AD&D expanded and refined the rules set forth in the original version of the game, making them much clearer. In a major step up for the company, AD&D came as a set of 3 hardcover books, as opposed to the booklets of the previous versions. These core rule books were published between 1977 and 1979. It included the Monster Manual, the Player's Handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Basic sets were designed for novices just beginning a campaign, offering detailed rules for characters creation and instructions for both players and dungeon masters. By launching both lines of products simultaneously, DSR was able to widen its audience and bring in new players, but the game remained relatively unknown in the mainstream media, that is, up until it appeared in the national news. In 1979, D&D player and Michigan State University student James Dallas Egbert III went missing. William Deere, a private detective hired by Egbert's family, became convinced D&D was to blame. The sale of Wizards of the Coast to Hasbro also allowed D&D to expand into new mediums beyond the core rulebooks. It says, "You are leaving the world of reality into the world of fantasy. It advocated murder, decapitation, and ungoing. This isn't a healthy game." Deere said in 2016, news outlets and evangelical groups quickly latched onto the story, sparking a nationwide conspiracy that D&D had somehow driven Egbert to insanity, with many reporting that he ventured into Michigan State's underground tunnels in some sort of satanic D&D ritual. The claims were unsubstantiated. Egbert was found a month later. He died by suicide a year after his disappearance. These events occurred on the precipice of the satanic panic of the 1980s, a moral panic during which paranoia and conspiracy theories about Satanism and satanic ritual abuse were rampant. As the satanic panic ramped up, D&D became just one of its numerous targets. The 1982 movie Mazes and Monsters, starring Tom Hanks, only added to the fuel to the fire. Complete with satanic and cult imagery, it follows a group of college students whose obsession with fantasy role-playing games leads to tragedy. In 1982, another D&D player died by suicide, and in 1983, his mother, Patricia A. Pulling, formed an organization called Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, BAD, to advocate against D&D, saying the game promoted voodoo, sex perversion, barbarism, and necromantics. "We were raised Christian, we would go to church often, and religion was important to my family. So to hear people say D&D was satanic was kind of shocking," says Luke Kayaks, who says his father began receiving death threats. "People would drive by our house slowly, which worried my parents a lot. So we had to erect a 6-foot cyclone fence around our house and put a security system. And we had our dogs run at night, and my dad made sure he was armed whenever he left the house." Kayaks even began wearing a bulletproof vest to conventions. DSR soon hired Dr. Joyce Brothers, a famous psychologist and television personality, to counter the criticism D&D was facing in the media. "There is good and evil in life, and the way Dungeons & Dragons is set up is that good triumphs over evil," she said in a radio interview with Canadian talk show host Neil McKenty. In 2008, reflecting on the controversy, Arneson, who died in 2009, suggested parents should have just watched their kids play the game. "They will understand that anything this nerdy can't possibly lead to being possessed by the devil," he said. But despite the bad press, the moral panic ended up benefiting sales. The previously niche hobby was making news. D&D's rise and fall and rise. In the early 80s, amid the chaos of the satanic panic, D&D officially entered DSR overestimated how much sales would continue to rise, sinking it into serious financial trouble. In 1984, DSR began publishing novels based on D&D, set in the Dragonlance universe. The books were originally conceived by husband and wife duo Tracy and Laura Hickman, working with editor Margaret Weiss. There are now more than 200 D&D-inspired books written by a variety of authors, with the most recent being 2024's Dragons of Eternity. After a series of layoffs in 1985, Gygax hired businesswoman Lorraine Williams. Williams could see the company's potential, and in October of that year she went behind Gygax's back, purchasing his partner's shares, which made her the majority of the shareholder. Fed up and feeling betrayed, Gygax, who felt like the company was being overtaken by non-gamers, sold his own shares in 1985 and officially left DSR. The company culture changed under Williams, and many gamers have blamed her for just about every bad thing that happened to DSR. She was notoriously tough and rarely interacted with employees on the creative side. She was not always in touch with what we did, but she was very loyal. Her reputation was so great and almost mythologized, where people were afraid to say no to her. Jim Fallon, director of sales and marketing at DSR, said in D&D historian Ben Riggs' 2022 book Slaying the Dragon: A Secret History of Dungeons & Dragons. There were even rumors that she was the model for the Lady of Pain character from the Planescape setting. But despite, or perhaps because of, her tough leadership style, the company continued to thrive. The design team was led by David Zeb Cook, a former English teacher from Nebraska who had been working at DSR for years. Along with a small team of other designers, Cook began to work on a second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. While the rulebook maintained many of the core principles and design elements of the previous edition, some of the rules were honed, making them easier to follow. Here we have Alan Cooley was hired by Main Street Board Game Cafe in Huntington, New York, to run a weekly D&D game for teens and tweens. Steve Winter, one of the second edition designers, described the original rules to Riggs as having a one-on-one conversation with Gary Gygax. They were charming but not much help when a question arose in the middle of a battle. Released in 1989, the second edition was a success, with over 400,000 copies sold in the first year. The company also began expanding the universe, publishing a large number of supplements. Some of the most famous were Forgotten Realms, which explored a mysterious parallel world, Planescape, which brought players through interdimensional magic portals, and Ravensloft, in which players traversed a much darker setting, meeting sinister forces along the way. These new settings were elevated from previous products, which tended to include only the rules and perhaps some dice. Full-color maps, posters, player guides, dice, miniatures, video cassettes, and CDs made them a feast at the gaming table. From a fan's point of view, these products were incredible. They are storehouses of story and playgrounds for dreams. Riggs wrote in Slaying the Dragon. Williams continued to expand the brand into other mediums throughout the late 80s and 90s, including licensed D&D properties to DC Comics. The books sold well, but when DSR tried to publish their own line of comics, the relationship with DC soured. Williams was able to pull DSR out of the hole by expanding the brand, but while D&D sales remained steady through the early 90s, they began to dip toward the latter half of the decade. Sales, acquisitions, and a D20 boom. By the mid-1990s, DSR was in serious financial trouble. Each new supplement the company published sold worse than the one before it. Buried in debt and nearing bankruptcy, in 1997 DSR was ultimately sold to the gaming company Wizards of the Coast via an intermediary, the small gaming company Five Rings Publishing. As part of the deal, Wizards also bought Five Rings. At the time, Wizards of the Coast dominated the tabletop and collectible card game industry, with games like Magic the Gathering, the product that created the collectible card game genre. After the acquisition, Wizards of the Coast had employees Ryan Dancy and Lisa Stevens investigate DSR's finances to figure out why the company had been going under. The two discovered that for the prices D&D products stealing customers from itself, forcing it to make two products to keep the same number of customers, Riggs wrote. In 1999, Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast, but it remained semi-independent until 2001, when it was consolidated into Hasbro's game division. In 2000, the third edition of Dungeons & Dragons was released, with the first major rule revision in over a decade. Even though the basic editions had been discontinued several years prior, the second edition was still referred to as Advanced D&D. But with the third edition, the word Advanced was dropped, and the game became just D&D. Since the game's origin, various D&D rules and supplements have been used. All kinds of exotic dice, including the D20, the third standardized the system. The D20 dice became just so ineluctably bound to the look and feel of playing D&D. The experience of D&D is so about these weird little math rocks, as kids call them today, says Peterson. Led by game designer Jonathan Tweet, the D20 system aimed to standardize systems across role-playing games by using the 20-set dice to determine most of the core actions. A Q&A published on the Wizards of the Coast website read, "The company believes that one of the major factors which caused the collapse of the commercial tabletop RPG market from 1993 to 1996 was the proliferation of different incompatible core game systems. Hence, they released the system under the Open Game license, which allowed other companies to use it without paying for the license, leading to a huge boom in role-playing games in the early 2000s. The sale to Hasbro also allowed D&D to expand to new mediums beyond the rulebook, launching toys and paraphernalia in conjunction with Hasbro's other toys. Although they were not necessary to play, figurines and miniatures had long been part of game for many players, but under the supervision of Hasbro in 2003, Wizards of the Coast expanded the production of miniatures, releasing multiple unique sets over the next few years. Additionally, Hasbro's large-scale distribution capabilities allowed D&D to be sold in big box stores such as Walmart and Target, and previously had only been available in specialty gaming stores. Here we have early D&D adventures, codified the idea of a dungeon crawl, where the players spend sessions exploring a dungeon created by their dungeon master or lifted from a source book. Here we have the worlds of D&D are always expanding in these adventure journeys. Through the radiant citadel, wildlings are lured by high-spirited music and sweet foods. I like the little neon lights here. There. It's fun. Now, in 2008, a few months before the fourth edition of D&D was released, Gygax passed away from a series of strokes. While he was no longer officially tied to D&D, he was essentially associated with it by players, so gamers around the world held D&D games in his honor, including a group of his friends and family who met at Lake Geneva's American Legion Hall. They played games and watched D&D cartoons, and people shared memories about Gygax. That was really cathartic for my family to see so many people gathered together, enjoying what he loved so much, playing games, and the camaraderie of other people, says Luke Gygax. The event went on to become an important tradition. I hold GaryCon every year in March as a memorial to my dad, and it's up to like 3,500 people now. It's become quite a cornerstone of the gaming community, says Luke, who aims to preserve his father's legacy and memory. He taught us that we can still play and just plugging that into this new streamlined engine that is a modern masterpiece of RPG design, Peterson says. D&D got a major bump in popularity in 2016 when Netflix released the first season of Stranger Things. The show takes place in the 1980s and follows a group of friends who begin to unravel the mysteries behind supernatural forces in their small town. The kids are frequently seen playing D&D in the first season, and some of the show's elements are even inspired by the game. The Demogorgon, one of the main antagonists on the show, has appeared in every edition of D&D, and Vecna, another character on Stranger Things, is a longtime D&D boss villain and the titular star of a brand new adventure, Vecna Eve of Ruin, launched for D&D's 50th anniversary. Additionally, in a similar dynamic to D&D campaign, the show's characters take on certain roles. Mike Wheeler is smart and moral. Will Byers is clever and selfless. Eleven is loyal and protective. The show has sparked a wave of nostalgia for those who grew up playing the game, and it also inspired new players to pick up the hobby. One analysis found that Google searches for Dungeons & Dragons starter kits increased by 250% during the show's 4th season in 2022, when some of the main characters joined the Hellfire Club, their high school D&D group. In 2017, D&D got another major upgrade with the launch of D&D Beyond, an online tool for 5th edition that allows players to digitally access rulebooks, character sheets, and spells. According to Adam Bradford, the product lead, the goal was to enhance the D&D experience, not turn it into a video game. We want to minimize the negative impact of rules at the table, such as taking a long time to thumbing through books to find an obscure rule, not remembering all your character's options, he said in a 2017 interview with Gizmodo Australia. Even though D&D campaigns had to stop or go virtual, the game had another major boom during the pandemic with a 33% increase in sales in 2020. We have seen a substantial increase in interest in tabletop gaming overall in the last year, Dan Leader, Vice President of Operations, said at Noble Knight Games, told CNBC in 2021. Now as D&D celebrates its 50th anniversary, its impact on not only the gaming industry, but on pop culture in general, is incredible. Luke Gygax says that he was recently shopping for a birthday card when he saw one that says, Happy Level Up Day. That's a concept that my dad created for Dungeons & Dragons way back in the early 70s, and now it's just common parlance, he says. This outcast was somehow able to come up with a complex structure that has brought billions of hours of joy and influenced our culture. I'm amazed that the more I dig, the more I see his fingerprints on things. Mapping the story, D&D has followed a winding road of remakes and revamps. These series entries and pop culture moments mark the role-playing game's evolution. By Courtney Mifsud. Intriglia, I think. A new game, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson wrote a rulebook for Dungeons & Dragons crafted on Gygax's home typewriter. After they scraped together $2,400 for the startup costs, Gygax and Don Kay founded Tactical Studio Rules, TSR, in October. It was the start in 1973. In 1974, it says release day. TSR released Original Dungeons & Dragons, or OD&D. There were 3 booklets, all written as if the player already knew how to play a similar game. The set introduced concepts that would become standard in later editions, including the ability scores, armor class, and character classes. The first 1,000 hand-assembled copies sold quickly. 1975, Blackmore Mound. DSR released Arneson's Blackmore, a supplementary rulebook for the original edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The supplement added 2 character subclasses, Assassin, a Thief subclass, and Monk, which was then a Cleric subclass. Blackmore also introduced the Temple of the Frog, the first ever role-playing game adventure for D&D. I received Blackmore and on 2 different pages there. 1976, Psionic Minds 3 D&D supplements were released. Swords and Spells, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, and Eldritch Wizardry. The latter was the first source book to feature monstrous humanoid aberrations called illithids, commonly known as mind flayers. Neat. 1977, served as advanced and definitive version for players who had graduated from the basic set. The release was split into 3 books: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. This D&D pattern has stayed the same to this day. In 1980, we got a canvas for roleplay, The World of Greyhawk Fantasy. The setting was the original World of Greyhawk campaign setting sourcebook, which was first published sourcebook to describe the campaign setting in detail. The release also included 2 large maps, a 32-page booklet that gave an overview of the setting. That's cool to see. 1983, Teens and Toons. The animated Dungeons & Dragons television show ran from 1983 to 1985. The series focused on 6 friends who were transported to the realms of D&D by way of an amusement park roller coaster. DSR would go on to release a board game and several comic books inspired by the cartoon. 1984, Dragon's Doom. DSR published the first Dragonlance game module, Dragons of Despair, and the first Dragonlance novel, Dragons of Autumn Twilight. Dragonlances are weapons created for killing dragons during the Third Dragon War. 1985, Stats and Cities. DSR released Langmar, City of Adventure, as a supplement to AD&D. This text contained the adventure ideas, descriptions of city areas, and statistics for prominent non-playable characters. Langmar was updated in 1993 for 2nd edition AD&D. It's in 1985. 1989 brings Fiend's Folly. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition was published, featuring new rules and character classes. The release aligned with an effort by DSR to soften aspects of the game that had attracted negative publicity, most notably the removal of demons and devils, which were renamed Denari and Batazu, respectively. Batazu, sorry. 1990 has Ships and Sorcery. A year after the Spelljammer campaign setting was released, DSR put out a Wild Space Adventure book and the Monstrous Compendium Spelljammer Appendix, which included fantasy outer space creatures, which included the mechanical constructs, clockwork horrors, and the 10-legged asteroid spiders. 1991, Desert Dangers. Wanting to release something different, DSR produced Dark Sun, a post-apocalyptic campaign setting where food and water were scarce. Resource management was a larger part of this campaign setting than in past worlds, and according to the game's designer, Rick Swan, the desert setting was a metaphor for struggle and despair. 1992, Dungeons and Dinosaurs. Developed for the Sega Genesis, Dungeons & Dragons Warriors of the Eternal Sun used creatures and lore from D&D Hollow World campaign setting, including dinosaurs and lizardmen, set in the Land of Fate. The Alkadim campaign setting was launched using 1001 Nights as a central theme. Okay. That's interesting. I've heard about that but never played it. I really enjoy 1001 Nights, so I might have to check that out. 1993, Horror and Terror. With Gothic-inspired characters and vampire lore, the Ravenloft campaign setting existed in the Pocket Dimension. Demiplane of Dread. 10 years after the sourcebook released, DSR published the adventure module House of Strahd. The vampire Strahd von Zarovich, who oversees his own domain of Barovia, is best known of Ravenloft's Dark Lords. 1994, Planar Travel. The Planescape campaign setting explored realms, including the inner planes of air, earth, fire, and water, and the outer planes where gods and deities reside. Characters can move from plane to plane using astral conduits or portals. 1997, Wizards Way. Magic the Gathering publisher Wizards of the Coast announced that it was purchasing DSR and its publishing rights. Wizards of the Coast also offered to relocate Wisconsin-based DSR employees to the West Coast. 1998, those changes in version 3.5 and 3rd edition, which was retroactively deemed D&D 3.0 by the community, remained largely compatible with each other. 2004, new technologies. A 320-page sourcebook introduced Eberron, a campaign setting that followed a destructive war. It included some non-traditional fantasy technology such as skyships and magic-powered mechanical beings. More than 20 supplements for the Eberron setting were released over the next 4 years. 2005, a flopped flick. Dungeons & Dragons: Wrath of the Dragon God, directed by Gary Lively, released straight to video. The film served as a standalone sequel to the 2000 movie and featured Bruce Payne reprising his role as Damodar. IGN rated it a 3 out of 10, telling anyone looking for a meaningful Dungeons & Dragons experience to just play the game. 2008, New Fae Friends. The core rulebooks for 4th edition D&D were released. 2008, D&D 4E was the first to integrate a paid digital subscription service, D&D Insider. The 4th edition also introduced Eladrin, Fae humanoids who lived in the Feywild. As a core playable race, Eladrin are known for having brilliant, metallic-colored or white hair and striking eyes. 2012, Vile Darkness. Director Lively attempted another D&D film adaptation, Dungeons & Dragons 3: The Book of Vile Darkness, which went direct to DVD in the UK and premiered in the US as a sci-fi original movie. Overhaul Games remastered the original Baldur's Gate game, combining it with the expansion Tales of the Sword Coast. In 2014, Modern Edition Wizards of the Coast released Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The new release aimed to simplify the rules, making the game more accessible to all players. The first official release for D&D 5th edition was a 32-page starter set followed by the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition core rulebooks, Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide. This is where I was introduced to D&D, was 5th edition. 2015, Sandbox Sunders. Wizard of the Coast announced new Elemental Evil storyline, which included the new adventure module Princess of the Apocalypse. Princess was celebrated as a sandbox adventure, meaning the world was dynamic enough for players to explore on their own without much step-by-step by the Dungeon Master. 2016, Giants in the Sky. Baldur's Gate Siege of the Dragonspear, an expansion to the Enhanced Edition released across platforms. Wizard of the Coast released the supplemental sourcebook, Hollow's Guide to Monsters, along with the adventure Storm King's Thunder, set in the savage frontier region of the Forgotten Realms. 2017, A Digital Revolution. Wizard of the Coast released adventure module Tales from the Yawning Portal and Tomb of the 2024, looking forward, celebrating the 50th anniversary of D&D, Wizards of the Coast released the new source book, the Book of Many Things, and several adventures, including Descent into the Lost Caverns of Solganth and Vecna, Eve of Ruin. Retooling the existing D&D 5th edition rules, Wizards released a new player's handbook and plans to roll out a new Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual. We have D&D 6th edition. Chapter 2, D&D on Screen. While the game is all about players working together, some media mainstays encourage us to just sit back and watch. Legendary D&D villain Vecna has made pop culture appearances in Stranger Things and Critical Role. The Titans of Tabletop. The most prolific voices in the tabletop role-playing space share what it's like to bring their storytelling on stage. By Courtney Mifsud Intraglia. I'm sorry if I pronounced his name wrong. Dimensions 20's intrepid heroes from top left: Lou Wilson, Allie Beardsley, Brian Murphy, Zach Oyama, Seban Thompson, and Emily Axford. In front, Brennan Lee Mulligan. Enter a buzzing tavern, eager to partake in some drink and mingle with other patrons. On the way inside, a life-size mimic with its menacing toothy maw is noticeable from across the room. Even with its monstrous denizens, the tavern is impeccably decorated with intricate wooden reliefs and carvings depicting dragon heads, owl bears, and battle axes. Along the ceiling's beams, sigils carved into the wood spell out tomorrow's story is still unwritten in Thorasta, a language largely known as common on the continent of Faerun. As I settle into my seat with a tankard of wine, I clock a tiefling wizard entering from behind me on the arm of a paladin in full regalia, minus the clanking plate mail. Despite the fantastical ambience, I'm not actually in Faerun's Sword Coast, nor am I anywhere in the Forgotten Realms. I'm a few blocks away from New York City's Port Authority bus terminal at Stage 42 Theater, about to play Dungeons & Dragons with 500 new friends. Dungeons & Dragons, the 20-sided tavern, is an off-Broadway show in which seasoned storytellers and comedians interact with the audience to complete a largely improvised D&D session, complete with dice rolls, initiative orders, and charismatic dungeon master trying to keep the story on the rails. The warm-hearted and silly spectacle has been covered by a myriad of mainstream outlets, including the New York Times and Rolling Stone. As D&D has evolved from a fringe hobby into a mainstream medium, the idea of people watching others play the tabletop game instead of playing themselves has exploded on a similar track. Actual play, sometimes called live play, is a new genre of storytelling in which people play a tabletop role-playing games, TTRPGs, for an audience, often through a podcast or online streaming show. Much like with D&D itself, the original supporters of the genre were mega-fan tabletop devotees finding community in a niche medium. But over the past several years, it has exploded with shows like Critical Role and Dimension 20 becoming large-scale franchises with robust merchandise programs, selling out stadiums with the fervor of a Taylor Swift or Olivia Rodrigo concert. Area clockwise from above, a physical rendering of the shape-changing mimic in Stage 42's waiting area. Sarah Davis Reynolds and DIGL. yourself, even if you're not. But this show expands beyond the bounds of actual plays and involves the audience in crucial, pivotal story decisions. From the second the guests take their seats, as the rows begin to fill, the three cast members, along with the Dungeon Master and co-creator David Andrew Greener, Laws, who goes by DAGL, dispense into the audience and begin checking in with each group of viewers. While we wait for the showtime, the cast seeks consent from individuals about whether or not they would like to be called on to participate on stage, and hands out prompts for the audience to fill out. They also point out instructions in the show bill for accessing the browser-based voting software designed by Gamiotics that is key for the most interactive elements of the production. On-screen depictions explain some basic Dungeons and Dragons concepts, like the intelligence and wisdom abilities. Intelligence is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. For more experienced viewers, these previews also pepper in-world Easter eggs like excerpts from Volo's Guide to Waterdeep, hinting at information that's specific to the show's Forgotten Realm metropolis setting. It's very important to us that your knowledge of D&D is not a barrier of entry here, DAGL tells me after the show. We want everyone to come and have a good time, even if you only saw the movie and have never played, if you've just heard about it, or if you've been playing for 20 years. Once the show begins, DAGL and the tavern keeper, Sarah Davis Reynolds, also a co-creator and story designer, continue to teach the audience and explaining what might happen depending on information to newcomers without feeling exhaustive and stale to seasoned players. Although the audience has already met the cast ahead of showtime, DAGL formally introduces the three adventurers: a warrior, Tyler Noel Phoenix, a mage, Ellen Murphy, and trickster, Diego F. Salinas. But the three comedians don't know who they're role-playing yet. That's for the audience to determine for them. Through the Gamiotics voting system, we're given choices of different characters for each of the three main cast members to roleplay, from a short list pulled from 33 total characters designed for the show. On the Thursday night show I attended, our heroes were a dwarven supervillain, an undead cowboy, and a suspicious monk who was really just two kids in a trench coat. Each character is allocated a third of the audience, who are selected at random by a handout in the production's playbill to vote their key choices, lend support in pivotal moments, and turn the story's tide through the button-mashing style games and puzzles. The real thing we were looking for in this experience was how does it feel when 500 people are playing together, DAGL says. Your voice and your choice are integral to each night. Without you, we can't tell the story. By the end of the show, my sides hurt from laughing and cheering. I was taken on stage by DAGL and Reynolds and given a peek at their DJ booth, a station that controls the show's live effect elements. Here, the two creators have access to the various dice cameras, the on-screen health bars, and a variety of compact effects. DAGL then points me to a sprawling on-screen module with each decision and choice from the audience that the audience can make mapped out in a web of variables, successes and failures. We try to make the show as balanced as possible so that every decision not only has consequences, but because every decision does have consequences, but every decision has equal weight and equal draw for the audience, he says. Reynolds adds, if you come to the show 3, 5, or 10 times, you're seeing something different every time. In the wake of the chaos after the apogee solstice, a group of brave heroes called the Mighty Nine join forces to deal with the rolling dangers suddenly unleashed. That was the promised premise when more than 12,000 fans gathered in London's Wembley Arena star in a Dungeons & Dragons show called Critical Role. The Scottish comedian Daniel Sloss introduced Dungeon Master DM Matthew Mercer and his fellow Critical Role cast members Ashley Johnson, Marisha Ray, Dallas Jaff, Travis Willingham, Sam Regal, Laura Bailey, and Liam O'Brien. The crew were dressed up as versions of the characters they brought to life through 141 episodes of the show's second season and campaign. Regal notably did not dress up as his character, instead donning a Freddie Mercury-inspired ensemble. The massive crowd sang along to the program's theme song and roared at every natural 20 dice roll. Because we're all theater kids, and there's a special kind of energy, says Mercer, who serves as the Chief Creative Officer of Critical Role Productions and the DM of the program's 3 major campaigns. There really is a kind of sharing energy with anyone who's present, especially if they're all there and excited for this, as you are. Whether on Twitch or YouTube, the show's primary outlets, or on a stadium stage, Mercer weaves together rich narratives and expansive world building as he welcomes us into Exandria, the in-game Critical Role universe that he created and continues to showcase. The root of Mercer's tabletop storytelling goes back to his early high school days, when he was invited to join a game with some older classmates whom he admired. I discovered that their version of playing the game wasn't quite the version that I was excited for, Mercer says. I decided to Dungeon Master so I could create the game that I was excited to play with my friends, and that's how it's been ever since. Dungeons & Dragons became a creative outlet that Mercer was fully immersed in, where he could craft roles and worlds that he was really proud of. It served as a place for me to bond with my closest friends, to share experiences that made us closer and taught us all a little bit about each other, he says. It was also a cornerstone to my modicum of a social life as an introverted, nerdy kid in high school, and eventually it led to me opening up a little bit and becoming interested in the performing arts and learning that I enjoy acting. The Critical Role cast is composed of voice actors, and many of them have earned accolades for their work. Mercer has lent his voice to scores of characters including Yuzuki Kitagawa in video game Persona 5 Royal and Persona 5 Strikers, Captain Levi Ackerman in anime series Attack on Titan, and Cassidy in video game Overwatch. He was on the set of the film Resident Evil Damnation while Mercer was recording the character Leon S. Kennedy that the Critical Role cast started to come together. Outside the recording booth, O'Brien, who was voice directing the project, told Mercer that he used to play D&D when he was a kid. Mercer shared that he had too, but he had never stopped, and O'Brien should join him for a game or two. I had brand new kids at that point, and I had no free time, O'Brien recalls. I was like, that doesn't sound like it's for me, but I'm glad you are having fun with it. A year or two later, O'Brien approached Mercer to take him up on the offer. They assembled a table of voice actors, friends, at the small apartment of Mercer and his partner, Marisha Ray, who now is the creative director at Critical Role Productions. Matt brought me in, as well as Nelson Jaff, because we have both experienced D&D players and could help guide the newbies, Ray says. O'Brien brought in Willingham and Bailey for the first game. They had such a good time playing that Johnson joined for the second. Johnson told Alicia Day, the co-founder of Geek and Sundry, about their home game, which was halfway through a campaign. Then Day approached the group about playing it in a live stream format for the Geek and Sundry's Twitch channel. They streamed their first episode in March 2015, picking up the adventures of a party called Vox Machina. According to O'Brien, the cast didn't think playing on camera would work, but they were wrong. Interest exploded during their initial campaign, and the group was getting popular enough that they had to form their own company. So many stories you hear about how you don't go into business with your friends, says Mercer. There's all these horror stories of that turning into lessons that end friendships. The tiresome battle. The company has brought these adventures to life through another medium, television. In the middle of the campaign 1, there were so many times that something would happen in a game, and we'd be like, damn. Imagine how awesome this would be animated. Ray says, amid their second campaign on March 4th, 2019, the Critical Role cast launched a Kickstarter campaign to raise funds for a 22-minute animation called Critical Role, The Legend of Vox Machina animated special. Within an hour of launch, the Kickstarter had raised more than $1 million. At the end of the first full day, all of the announced stretch goals had been unlocked, and the total had been reached more than 4.3 million. With such support, the project expanded into an R-rated animated series on Amazon called The Legend of Vox Machina, which chronicles the adventures from Critical Role's first campaign. The show's third season arrived in October 2024, and a new show focusing on the second campaign, Mighty Nine, has been announced. I asked O'Brien how it felt to have his half-elf rogue paladin druid Axodon come to life in this new medium. Can you just put a sigh into print? To date, it's been the most rewarding moment of my creative life, he says. This is the first time that we all got to make a story together. It's our story. I'm not facilitating someone else. We empowered ourselves. On the road to Kamada, the capital city of the food-based world of Calorum, among the people, peppermint trees, a caravan of the nations of Candila's diplomatic envoy is ambushed, seemingly by Meatland brigades. The story that follows includes intense political subterfuge, villainous monologues, and hard candy people in a saga modeling Game of Thrones. The Crown of Candy, which aired in 2020, is the 6th season of Dimension 20 and its third campaign, with the main cast known as the Intrepid Heroes. Produced by Dropout, an independent comedy-based streaming service, Dimension 20 features Game Master Brennan Lee Mulligan and a table full of comedians and pro gamers telling stories through Dungeons & Dragons. To date, the series has run through 22 seasons, with themes ranging from John Hughes meets Fantasy High School to A Court of Regency era archfey. In the coming months, Dimension 20 will host a live show in New York City's massive Madison Square Garden, aptly named Gauntlet at the Garden. Mulligan was introduced to tabletop role-playing games by Elaine Lee, a celebrated playwright and writer, and the future Game Master's mom. Lee, who authored the graphic novel series Starstruck, helped Mulligan find a gaming group and learn how to play. When he was 10, he started running games for his friends, not unlike what he does now. The first time I ran a game after it ended, I told my mom this was the most stressful day of my life, Mulligan says. And I went, can we schedule the next one? College Humor launched the Dropout TV video platform. In order to be successful, it needed new original content. Mulligan was mulling over market research and had an idea. What was Dropout looking for? Improvisational, unscripted, long-form content, he says. Actual play has the benefit of being similar in production mode to the kind of panel game shows we do. By the time the first season of Dimension 20 aired, the dominant actual play shows were either edited audio format podcasts or weekly live streams like Critical Role, which had chat-based interactions with viewers. Knowing they were going to be video-on-demand service, they didn't have any touch points for what success would look like. If we are edited, we know we'll lose chat. If we lose the interactivity and that feeling of, oh god, anything can happen. How can we make up for that, says Mulligan, recalling the dilemma and how leaning into creative constraint delivered a production value hailed as second to none. The editing is going to help you follow the storyline and keep things moving along. We're going to have amazing coverage of the battle, sets, and production designer Rick Perry's beautiful minis. In this model, we lean into what editing allows you to do. By the time Mulligan pitched Dimension 20, he had already been running games for 5 out of 6 main Intrepid Heroes. Spawn Thompson, Emily Axford, Zach Oyama, and Brian Murphy all had experience as improv comedians at College Humor. Lou Wilson was not a college humor cast member, but had significant experience performing and playing with Mulligan. The sixth member of the Intrepid Heroes, Allie Beardson, had never actually played D&D before and learned the game on screen as Kristen Appleby's in Fantasy High Dimension 20's first season. I had heard of D&D growing up, but it was linked to some sort of satanic idea that my parents had, says Beardsley, who grew up in a very religious household, something that they channeled into the character Kristen. After the first season, it was clear that Dropout had caught the lightning in a bottle, with this 6 players and Mulligan as DM, and the producers continued to lean into that group's exciting dynamic. There's something magical about what happens when the 7 of us are in a room together, in which we had just become more than the sum of our parts, Thompson says. They made me much better, and I feel like I helped them be better as well. Above, Mulligan with the stars of Dungeons and Drag Queens. Jujubee, Bob the Drag Queen, Alaska 5000, and Monet Exchange. Opposite, the hand-painted minis of Dimension 20 Never After. Dimension 20 fluctuates between seasons that retain the main cast and seasons that include other gaming experts and comedians, sometimes with Brennan at the table instead of DMing. One of the most infamous guest-focused seasons did not bring in anyone from the larger Dropout universe or any gamers in the space, and became the perfect medium for teaching novice D&D players how to play. I spent a good 3 years getting hired at Dimension 20, making the actual play come up with all the different ways to deconstruct a script for a company so that they could teach D&D faster, says Carlos Luna, the show's series producer and co-executive producer. I did not have on my bingo card that the best way to do it with the biggest audience and the most understanding at the table would be drag queens. In 2023, Dimension 20 released Dungeons and Drag Queens, a story that takes place in a macabre underworld and features the pinnacles of RuPaul's Drag Race royalty. With Mulligan in the Game Master seat, the show included 4 players. Alaska 5000 as Princess, Bob the Drag Queen as Gertrude, Jujubee as Twyla, and Monet Exchange as Troyan. They are apex performers, and not just in the world of drag, in the world of entertainment, Mulligan exclaims. For them to say, I'm going to learn a word math game on camera is a level of confidence, vulnerability, intelligence, and bravery. Dimension 20 and Critical Role are part of a larger community where the players collaborate and contribute to one another's programs. Mercer has DM'd The Ravening War, a prequel season to Dimension 20's The Crown of Candy. Ed Mulligan has DM'd the Critical Role table for the apocalyptic Exandria Unlimited Calamity. Many others in the space straddle these programs, such as Abria Iyengar, who has DM'd the other Exandria Unlimited campaigns, along with multiple Dimension 20 seasons. So many people in this community have been friends since well before the rise of live plays, Ray explains. We all like each other, and we have a love and a bond through this weird hobby that we've all dedicated so much of our lives to. Stepping onto a different set to play or run the games can be jarringly a different experience. Battle maps and Critical Role are made in Mercer's map room with scores of pre-made minis and figurines, which allows him or other guest DM to put together an impromptu battle map in as little as 20 minutes. On the other hand, seasons of Dimension 20 with their expansive custom battle maps and immersive projections and added props have begun production well before players ever sit down in the dome. To make that happen, Rick Perry, the series production designer, creative producer, and co-executive producer, sits down with each DM to discuss the world they're trying to build so that they can physically construct it well in advance. Thomas Melody adds immense creative pressure on Barry's team, as with Iyengar's battle within the body of a giant bear, which she ran for a 2023 campaign Burroughs End. Barry describes his team and guests that they work with are as compulsive overachievers. We're all trying to one-up ourselves. We're trying to entertain ourselves and make each other laugh, he says. We just keep opening new doors and stepping through. The day the tickets went on sale for Dimension 20's Madison Square Garden show, Luna hoped that they'd be lucky enough to sell a few thousand. If they didn't, what would that mean for the program? And what would this endeavor be considered worth it? When we woke up in the morning, someone pinged us and said there were 20 or 30,000 people in the queue. Luna says, when Ticketmaster's dynamic ticket pricing system, which hikes up the cost in accordance to demand, kicked in, the average 150 to 200 ticket price soared to about 2,000. In a statement released on social media, Dimension 20 apologized to fans and said the vast majority of tickets that were purchased were $119. The company announced that they would be halting all dynamic pricing on this and future events, and implemented a lottery system through which fans can score tickets for just $35, a similar system to Olivia Rodrigo's. The idea that the love we have for telling stories together has brought us to this moment. Dimension 20's Lou Wilson muses, I feel incredibly lucky. I feel incredibly grateful. I don't think I'll be able to really understand the immensity of those feelings until I'm standing in Madison Square Garden with 20,000 fans making a whole lot of noise. The immense response to the live show speaks to the size of the actual play community and its belief that these performers will put on a show worth traveling to see. After having exploded in popularity nearly a decade ago now, with a critical role, actual play is a unique medium that can be transformed across genres. The 20-Sided Tavern is a live show that is performed multiple times, and yet the story is different each time. I think actual play is such a fun medium because it is living in that space of imagination, says Dimension 20's Zach Oyama. So often, he says, a world doesn't translate well from book to movie, largely because what the reader imagined is not what gets presented. The actual play space is different. Everyone is right in what they are imagining. Oyama says, it can feel like weirdly real memories, even though you're describing a thing you did by rolling the dice just acted out verbally. When I asked both the Critical Role and Dimension 20 teams what they thought of the immense scale their programs have grown to, the consensus included terms like flabbergasted and befuddlement. Even more so, these creators say they are immeasurably thankful to the fans and viewers who have engaged with their work. Thanks to anybody who's followed our antics, Mercer says, as we conclude our interview. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to express my gratitude that anybody cared for our silly dice-rolling stories. October 17th, 2017, Stranger Things Stories. After its widely acclaimed first season, Time visited the show's set in 2017 to discuss how it moves forward, while channeling the nostalgia of the past by Daniel Diodario. Everyone's tired on the set of Stranger Things. I'm visiting on a Friday in May, and a months-long effects-heavy Season 2 shoot is grinding toward its end. It's going slow, says Millie Bobby Brown, the 13-year-old Emmy nominee who plays the supernatural character 11. Last season it felt like we were rapid. Everything was fast, she says, but now the anticipation from this fans scares everyone. It makes the Duffers stressed. It makes us stressed. The Duffers are Matt and Ross, identical 33-year-old twins, and the maestros of the show that was about the only thing everyone seemed to be able to agree on during the contentious summer of 2016. The Netflix series, whose 8-episode first season arrived with relatively little fanfare. That July was set in 1983 and told the story of a group of young Dungeons and Dragons playing friends who encounter interdimensional forces as they look for their missing friend, Will, Noah Schnapp, they befriend a mysteriously powerful preteen girl, Brown. Will's mother, Winona Ryder, unravels as she searches for him with the help of a hard-living cop, David Harbour, and Will's loner older brother, Charlie Eaton, warily teams up with other comeback role. It also brilliantly employed the visual language of John Hughes and Steven Spielberg, as well as the sinister yet comforting narratives of Stephen King. Stranger Things added up to something that not only felt like it came out of the 80s, but also let you relive the decade, even if you weren't there the first time around. All in one bingeable package. We have details from the Stranger Things set to show the creator's dedication to keeping viewers immersed in the 1980s. Eggo waffles, we got Webster's new elementary dictionary. We got like goggles taped with duct tape. We got crushed Coca-Cola can, AV cables. Stranger Things also became a huge hit. While Netflix does not release viewership numbers, the show made an obvious impact. Last Halloween, you might have noticed more than a few kids and grown-ups dressed up as 11 or wrapped in Christmas lights to look like Ryder's character Joyce at her most forlorn. The Stranger Things kids became fixtures at award shows, on late-night TV, on magazine covers. Hollywood took notice too, honoring the show with 18 Emmy nominations and the top prize at the Screen Actors Guild Awards. To see Meryl Streep standing up and clapping for us was so weird. I never really thought it would happen, says Brown. If Stranger Things seemed like a predestined success, it was fairly edgy, bet, even by Netflix standards. After all, the show's creators were green as they come. The Duffers had fairly thin resumes, a little seen horror film that released in 2015, a writing gig on a short-lived M. Night Shyamalan TV show, where they put together their pitch. It consisted of a book of images and a mock trailer summing up what their show would be. It was super nuts, says Matt. Sometimes I'll ask them point blank why they let us do it at all. Here we have from Left, Finn Wolfhard, Millie Bobby Brown, Caleb McLaughlin, and David Harbour in 2017. In action, the Duffers tend to move in tandem. When the scene of watching them film ends, one brother bolts to advise the actors, and the other is up and following before anyone can even parse, which is called cut. Which one called cut? Both wear t-shirts, jeans, and the sort of retro sneakers that look like what you might have worn to high school gym class in 1984. Between takes, the kids gleefully goof off. Their acting is jazzy and improvisational, as they're encouraged to amp up their terror take after take. The Duffers' parents are visiting the set today, watching the action with headphones on from behind their director's sons. Matt and Ross Duffer grew up in Durham, North Carolina, where Matt says it was hard to get or even hear about the more obscure films. Instead, they went to the video store and rented the sort of crowd-pleasing all ages movies Hollywood don't really make anymore. Or doesn't really make anymore. The Duffers claim that their influences are more tonal than specific, that they draw upon the cinema for the past for mood more than detail. We honestly weren't thinking about references as much, says Ross. We do a few winks, and of course we talked about E.T. when we first came up with the show, but that wasn't the primary focus. Let's just let them tell the best story we can, and hopefully we'll capture some of the magic of those movies we loved growing up. There's something about those references that's essential to Stranger Things' resonance. They've turned into an internet parlor game among fans who hunt out specific shots that might tie in the show to its adventure film heritage, for example. And despite the Duffers' protestations, it's easy to get them talking about specific sequences that are mentioned as homage. One scene I observed featured Max Sadie Sink driving a car with a block under her foot to reach the gas pedal. That's exactly like the short round in Temple of Doom, Ross says, referencing to John K. Kwan's character in the second Indiana Jones film, which was and size. It's much closer to what we have always wanted for the show to be, says Matt. The Duffers say the sequel moves the plot forward while keeping the signatures of the series. Among those signatures are, of course, the interplay between the kids, which is up against a ticking clock of sorts. As Matt puts it, our kids are growing, and we have to get the show out, whether it's a compromise or not. Among the biggest expectations for season 2 is that it comes before the show's youngest stars get much older. Working with the children plainly has its challenges. They're a pain in the ass. I love them, but by law you can only work with them for a certain number of hours, Matt tells me. We're having a somewhat rushed conversation during lunch break between shots for a scene that includes most of the kids. They're going to be yanked away from us at 7, even though we're not going to be done with them, he adds. Stranger Things isn't just about the kids. In the first season, Ryder delivered perhaps her best on-screen work since her Oscar-nominated performance in Martin Scorsese's 1993 The Age of Innocence. As Joyce, she frantically searches for a son everybody said was dead, but whose presence in it she could feel bleeding through the walls of her house. Harper, a Tony-nominated character actor who had appeared in James Bond franchise, brought soulful fatigue to the role of Jim Hopper, the alcoholic town police chief. Both actors tapped into undercurrents of pain and exhaustion. Ryder was nominated for a Golden Globe, Harper for an Emmy, rolling a cigarette in his set trailer. Harper recalls working with the Duffers, the greatest cinematic creative collaboration I had ever had. The differences between a Broadway-trained thespian and a pair of blockbuster video-trained directors have been fruitful for both parties. I'm much more intellectual and much more academic in my process. I'll always push for more explanation, Harper says, and they'll always be like, well, this is just kind of cool. They're coming at it from an intuitive place. I consider them one being. They share one mind. It's just twice as big as mine. As for working with children, Harper has had to push himself yet further. I've never had to work with kids before in this capacity. There are pleasures to it, and there are also things that are difficult, he says. When something's good, the relationships we develop with lead actors is kind of an effed up process. To do that with a 13-year-old child feels tricky. So, on the surface, it's all cute and everybody loves it, but underneath, there's a real complexity to it. Brown came at her role pretty straight, as child actors tend to do. 11 is part of me, and always will be. I don't drive with her, she says. I don't even know my lines for today's scene. So it's like I don't know what I'm doing, and that's what makes it so instinctual. Harper is right about one thing. It is really cute, and everybody does love it. On set, the kids are both full of capering zest and possessed of that sort of big kid voice that develops in your early teens. There's a lot of downtime between takes that adults might spend reading, knitting, or staring bored into a phone, but the kids have no trouble keeping busy. Caleb McLaughlin, who plays the cautious Lucas, introduces himself to the Duffers' parents by telling them with some gravity, I'm fans of you guys as well. Later on, he and Finn Wolfhard, who plays Mike, the heart of his friend group, kill time between takes by singing Bon Jovi into a fan held by casting mate Joe Keery. The whirling of the fan's blade distorts the sound of the words, oh, we're halfway there, come out like an on-the-fritz kitchen appliance. Keery plays Steve Hawkins, high school stud. At 25, he should know better, and charmingly doesn't, than to encourage them. They seem like a tribe, in other words, for Wolfhard, who starred in this year's blockbuster remake of Stephen King. Yet, being on set is an escape from class. School is difficult for me in elementary school, especially, he says. That was a hard battle. I was getting bullied a lot. For Gaten Matarazzo, finding roles became hard as he got older. original properties on executives' to-do lists. But what really resonates with viewers isn't just iteration, but a sense that the language of the past is being given a new phrasing. It, for instance, freshened up a widely known horror story with vivid effects and a slightly attitudinal spin while still revering the source material. This year's Beauty and the Beast overlaid gothic glam atop a fresh take on Disney's older tale. Both are among the most successful films in their respective genres ever made. Netflix's successes include revamps of past film hits like Full House, One Day at a Time, and Gilmore Girls. Each updated the story for contemporary audiences while keeping a nostalgic core of friendship and family intact. Part of what makes Stranger Things special is that it has tapped into our culture's fervent need to escape into the past. It subtracted smartphones and helicopter parents and added the sort of moral peril that any good 80s thriller depends upon. And for all its winks, the show is an irony-free zone. It's not nasty or mean or condescending or ironic or any of those things Matt says, which is a lot of content that can be right now. He punches the word content, a euphemism for art as product, because there's so much of that, and there's a lot of shows about protagonists doing really nasty things to other people. As a result, our own prosaic universe came to feel cinematic more than ever. We wanted to escape into what was remembered, the pleasures and pains of growing up and pop culture that accompanied us along the way. The Duffers have found a novel formula that does just that by balancing homage and kitsch to create something entirely new. Plus, the kids, whether you relate to them or to their parents, are on one hell of an adventure. As we grow up, Wolford tells me at one point on set, the characters grow up with us. For now, we've trademarked them until they remake it in 20 years or make a spin-off. And here we have Ross and Matt Duffer, the creators of the series, on set in Atlanta in 2017. D&D has been one of their biggest inspirations for the world of Stranger Things. Who is Vecna? The sinister villain of Stranger Things. Fourth season has a storied history within D&D's Forgotten Realms by James Greavy. I don't know. There has been a new big bad lurking in the upside down of season 4 of Stranger Things, as the series' previous villains. Remember Flair, the evil force that Eleven and the gang have to face in this year's takes its name from a classic Dungeons & Dragons monster, a being known as Vecna. Threatens Hawkins, Indiana, just as Vecna, the evil Angellic, threatened D&D players for decades, while Stranger Things villains are not exactly copies of the D&D monsters they take inspiration from. The characters of the show are avid players of the iconic tabletop game, as the series creators, the Duffer Brothers, were. As a result, there are several parallels between D&D and Stranger Things, not least including season 4's edition of Vecna. Here's what you need to know about the 4th season's terrifying monster, a wizard turned lick, who became the greatest D&D villain. Became the greatest D&D villain of all time. Who is Vecna? Vecna, a being from the earliest days of D&D lore, was not a fully formed character when he made his debut in the White Box, the very first version of D&D that creators Gary Gygax and David Arneson released in 1974, according to Chris Perkins, game design architect at D&D. That's in part because the original game had a very crude presentation, rather than the detailed lore D&D has today, and in part because initially Vecna was just that, parts. Vecna was this enigmatic figure originally. We didn't know much about him other than something happened, and this powerful wizard became an undead wizard, then was destroyed, leaving behind an eyeball and a left hand. Perkins says those were great artifacts of power in early D&D. Vecna became a legendary figure whose remains were powerful items that Dungeon Masters DMs could use as rewards for their players. We have the so much of D&D relies on the Dungeon Master making things up, it's not by any means a plot hole that the Stranger Things kids would be familiar enough with the beyond the artifacts to name their upside-down foe after him, and seeing as the Duffer brothers certainly kept up with D&D, it seems reasonable that Vecna's post-80s history might have influenced his depiction in the show. D&D has been part of Stranger Things from the start. The series begins with four friends playing a game that had their party of characters face off against a classic D&D foe named Demogorgon. When Will Byers goes missing, the monster from the Upside Down haunts them. The kids name the beast after the most dangerous evil monster they know, the Demogorgon from their D&D campaign. In Season 2, they continue this naming convention by giving the Upside Down Big Bad the name of another iconic D&D villain, the Mind Flayer. Throughout the seasons, the kids have continued to play the D&D, and Season 4 also features a plotline involving the real-life moral panic over Dungeons and Dragons, metal music, and other supposedly satanic pop culture that ran amok in the 80s. However, Perkins says there wasn't really a specific connection to Vecna, and has been guided satanic panic because the lake was more of an enigma compared with the actual devils and demons in the pages of the monster manual. Netflix revealed very few details about Vecna's inclusion in Stranger Things Season 4, beyond the name and a glimpse of the monster who looks much more human than the Demogorgon or Mind Flayer. While not an exact match of Vecna, as he's been portrayed in D&D over the years, there's a skeletal, undead, lick-like look to the Stranger Things version. Picture a tentacle-covered Freddy Krueger, and you're not too far off. We won't spoil exactly what the deal is with Stranger Things Vecna, but will say that he shares more than just a name with the D&D version. Vecna's exact depiction in D&D differs over the various editions, and each individual table of players, and the improv-heavy game can be wildly different. But if there's a core to Vecna, it's this. He had humble beginnings and searched for more knowledge and eventually ascended to new levels of power using dubious means at the expense of his own humanity. There are certainly echoes of this in his upside-down counterpart. There's a cold calculation to Vecna, Perkins says. I think we don't ever dig down into the layers of psyche that would reveal anything other than that. He's always deliberately sort of cast as an enigmatic or shadowy or mysterious figure whose true motives tend to be inscrutable. But I think that whenever he's shown up, he's been cold and calculating. Prior to the release of the season, Perkins didn't know how much Stranger Things Vecna would or would not be like the D&D baddie. He explains that Netflix reached out to Wizards of the Coast, and that D&D's franchise team worked with them to provide inspiration and answer questions. As part of this, the franchise team commissioned a new concept art for Vecna and put a story guide together to give to Netflix to use or not. In other words, the Duffer brothers had access to Vecna's D&D lore, so it was up to them how much of it they wanted to use. Regardless of the fidelity of Stranger Things Vecna, it's clear why the show would want to borrow his name, because Perkins counts him as one of D&D's most iconic villains, one who has endured through all of the many editions of the game. If I were to make a list of my top 3 villains, it would probably be Vecna, who is an iconic lich, Strahd, who is the iconic vampire, and probably Demogorgon, who is the iconic demon lord, he says. With one season to go, there's a chance that Stranger Things could borrow another D&D monster's name for their next bad guy. Perkins, who has no insider information, says he's fond of Lolth, the demon queen of spiders, but that he personally wouldn't mind seeing Orcus, a demon lord, and master of the undead, make his way into the show. He has got a connection to Vecna that few people know, because as the Prince of Undeath, Orcus holds the secret delictum. He basically gives it out to powerful wizards who pay deference to him or honor him in some way. So it's possible that Vecna actually pried the secrets of Lictum from Orcus. And here at the top we've got Stranger Things Vecna has a very different backstory than D&D's villain. Opposite the hand of Vecna is a vile artifact that grants its wearer access to powerful spells. see on screen. He mentions owlbears, mimics, gelatinous cubes, and even makes a nod to the 80s D&D television show, but no onions. Onions, asks Justice Smith, who plays Sorcerer Simon. What are the things you leave in the film? Clues, Grant says. Smith and Michelle Rodriguez say it together as they burst into laughter. Pine's response, Easter eggs. The main players of the D&D film have clearly bonded off screen, which reflects what audiences will get on screen when seeing Honor Among Thieves in theaters. In short, easy camaraderies and plenty of hijinks. In the film, Pine's Edgen and his barbarian bestie, Olga Rodriguez, bust out of prison after serving years for a dungeon heist gone wrong, setting them on a cross-country quest to reunite with Edgen's daughter, Kira Chloe Holman. Along the way, they link up with a motley crew of misfits, including Grant's Forge, an old acquaintance of the crew who has swindled his way into becoming the Lord of Neverwinter. There's also Sophia Lillis's Doric, an eco-warrior druid, and Rajejan's Page's Sank, a paladin who does not traffic in colloquialisms. And then there's the Kai Jelly, or the KY Jelly, I'm gonna call it Kai Jelly, which the cast say played a big part in bringing this movie to life. Page points to a scene involving a fish that had swallowed a baby tabaxi, a species of cat-like humanoids. To make it appear as slimy as it was covered in Kai Jelly, the actor says. The others had their own run-ins with the lube brand. All of us were covered in Kai Jelly at one point, Smith notes. Gelatinous cube day, Rodriguez adds. Pulling off a wild shape escape. Among the first ideas that came to directors John Francis Daly and Jonathan Goldstein when conceiving Dungeons & Dragons Honors Among Thieves, before they even pitched Paramount, was a sequence involving Doric, a druid now played by Lillis, with the shape-shifting ability known as Wild Shape. The filmmakers previously tried their hand at a tracking shot, one single uninterrupted take, with their previous movie Game Night. The camera followed Jason Bateman, Rachel McAdams, and Sharon Horgan as they played a high-stakes round of keep away with one coveted Fabergé egg. With the D&D, the duo wanted to one-up themselves. It's such a fun, immersive way to tell a story within the context of a scene, as long as it's justified, Daly tells EW in an interview with Goldstein. Being chased and following the characters as it goes from different animals that suit its physical environments just felt like a really delicious way to portray a chase scene. In his pursuit to reunite with his daughter and steal the riches back from backstabbing old cohort, the bard Edgen needed the services of a druid, a nature-loving spellcaster with the power of Wild Shape, which allows them to transform into various animals. That's where Doric comes in. Sneaking into Neverwinter Castle as a fly, Doric spies on the Forge in the hopes of finding where he's going to be storing all the winnings from an upcoming tournament. The devious red wizard, Sophina Daisyhead, sniffs her out, forcing Doric to transform in and out of various animal shapes in order to escape the castle with her life. The final cut makes this look like a one continuous shot, as Doric switches between a mouse, a hawk, a cat, a certain bird creature, and finally a deer. Of course, visual effects sorcery did some of the work, but that provided its own obstacles. Here we have opposite Sophia Lillis stars as the shape-shifting druid Doric, right here. Above, the film's characters strategize and bounce off one another as organically as real-life friend group, right here. It was really challenging because obviously we were having to fuse multiple sets and outdoor local locations in a way that feels like it's all being filmed in one shot, Daly says. We also tried as much as we could to rely on practical environments. Obviously our animals were fake for the most part, with the exception of our cat. But that was a lofty endeavor and one that I'm so appreciative of the studio for allowing us to do, because I think that everyone knew it was going in, that this was going to be over-ambitious and really rough to pull off. According to Goldstein, the sequence evolved as they realized what they could logistically pull off. When you're in the storyboard and pre-visualization stage, everything seems possible, and then you get closer to it, and you have to make certain changes, he says. Goldstein remembers that one version of the sequence rhetorically leaps through a wall as a mouse into a dining hall filled with soldiers who try to bash their beer mugs down on top of her. She scurries across the table. Another version gave a different spin to Doric's fall down a chimney and into a small house of cat form. Originally, when the cat lands in that little cabin, it looks over and there's a dog growling at it, and then it changed into, I think, a hyena, and then eventually changed into Doric's. Goldstein explains, we felt that wasn't quite working, so we had the idea of having a family be there. We shot the family against a blue screen in LA and merged the two things together. There was also a moment when the mouse enters the cell with the prisoner, Daly adds. In order to climb up the wall, it changes into a lizard. That was going to be the first time we really showcased that transformation without blocking it with any kind of foreground elements. We knew that to go from animal to humanoid forms is always going to be a bizarre looking thing. We get into uncanny valley territory in that I don't think anyone wants to see Doric in a grotesque half transformation state, but it was one of those opportunities where it's going from a CG asset to another CG asset. They felt they could do the wild shape more like the way Doric transforms from horse to owlbear earlier in the film. Ultimately, we couldn't afford to build another animal asset for that sequence, so it stayed as a mouse as it's climbing the brick wall to the window. Daly says, in a separate interview with EW and her co-stars, Lilith says she initially assumed she would have to deliver some kind of animal-like movement for the performance. She put in the work before realizing it would largely be done through CGI. What I did was I watched a lot of animal documentaries and videos of animals and how they move, she says, like how a bird flies off the branch. What do they do first with the arms and the legs? And how do they land? Because I thought I was at least going to have to do something animal-like. I also did a movement class and stuff like that, she adds. It was kind of embarrassing to walk around animal-like. Behind a surprise cameo, in addition to A-list talent like Pine, Rodriguez, Grant, and Page, Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves has another big-name star. A Star is Born and American Hustle actor Bradley Cooper makes a brief appearance as Marleman, the mild-mannered and extremely short ex-husband of Rodriguez, Holga. This is Holga. Cooper, however, was a late addition. In fact, an early cut of D&D showed filmmaker Dexter Fletcher, Rocket Man Eddie the Eagle, portraying the role opposite Rodriguez. In short, Fletcher did the crew a solid. Daly and Goldstein, who also wrote D&D with screenwriter Michael Giglio, also always intended to cast an instantly recognizable actor in the role of Marleman for the shock value. However, the COVID-19 pandemic made that challenging. Anybody who was willing to come work with us had to endure a quarantine in the UK, so it limited some of the choices we had, Goldstein says. They had one day to shoot the scene, in which Holga makes a pit stop at Marleman's home and meets his new girlfriend. Dexter was a friend of the court, and someone who we thought would be great, and he was kind enough to come and do the part, Goldstein adds. Fletcher has had an extended acting career, though these days he is more focused behind the camera on directing and producing. He knew the realities of the ask going in. He was great, Daly notes. It was a really sweet, touching scene, but our intention had always been to cast the role with someone who immediately, when they open the door, the audience gasps in recognition. When Daly was 19, the Freaks and Geeks alum acted on his short-lived Fox series, Kitchen Confidential, which starred Cooper. The two remained in touch. I asked him on a lark if he would be game to come and spend a day with us, Daly recalls. We sent him a rough cut of the film, and fortunately, he really responded to it. Part of the gag was the discrepancy between the pint-sized Marleman and the hulking Holga. The filmmakers first shot feels, Rodriguez. My heart ached for both of your characters. I felt like I dropped character for a second there, and it was like a spoof on a spoof within the movie. And then we can go back to suspension of disbelief, Rodriguez says, because for a moment there I think everybody is not thinking about the character within the movie. They're just seeing Bradley Cooper, this iconic actor celebrity on screen. And I thought it was kind of really funny. I noticed in the audience at Austin for the film's SXSW premiere, we all were thrown aback for a minute there. It was really cute. It was funny. It was a funny moment. The impact on their bodies. If you thought Paige looked like a snack on Bridgerton, you might want to check out Honor Among Thieves, which is saying. During a lively Comic-Con panel with the film's cast and creators that delivers a first look at the fantasy epic, Paige divulged that he had the best ass of his life while working out for the film. Lots of push-ups, lots of sit-ups, he said, of this training process. I got to swing a sword around for a living. Do you know what I mean? That is everything you'd want growing up. And coming into this, I got really, really good with the swords. It was lots and lots of stunt training, and so my thighs were killing me, and I had the best ass of my life. You could wash clothes on him, co-star Rodriguez shouted at the crowd as the crowd applauded. It was the best time you could possibly imagine on this job. I spent time training and slaying dragons, Paige added. Grant, who had been making a lot of S&M Dungeon Master jokes throughout the panel, said it was really getting my bottom into shape as well. Producer Jeremy Latchman told EW in an interview ahead of the Comic-Con panel that Paige's character is the ultimate paladin. He is wholly smart, on point, and just very, very determined, and does not love the vibe of some of the other people in the group because he's a very moral man, Latcham says. He represents the player who takes the Dungeons & Dragons game too seriously. Rodriguez also had a great deal of working out to do in preparation for the part of Olga. She says she gained about 10 pounds of muscle. Lots of working out, lots of protein shakes, lots of gas, she joked. And here we have, Pine describes the films as, I think it's Game of Thrones meets Princess Bride with a little bit of Spinal Tap. Interesting. Chapter 3, Modern Ventures. As more players experience the joys of Dungeons & Dragons, the franchise is expanding its reach into other business realms. Here we have the wreckage of a spell-jamming ship called the Lambert Zenith rests on the surface of a dying god in the vast astral sea. Ooh, that's really nice. We've got Dispel Dice sells handboard resin dice with myriad themes ranging from Elden Ring to Halloween. Interesting. Here we have Why Will Always Love Dice. The players create the characters, the Dungeon Master writes the story, but the dice decide everything. By Lisa Adashiko, I think, Idashiko. Some people learned how to bake homemade bread, speak a new language, or play a musical instrument during the coronavirus pandemic. But Des Wolf, a 27-year-old former teacher living in California, picked up a unique hobby, dice making. Wolf is the proprietor of an online specialty dice shop called Dreamy Dice, where she sells sets of glittery, translucent dice in varying shapes, sizes, and colors. Her creations fetch prices as high as $200 plus for a set. Her most expensive single die is currently the 40mm 20-sided Sky Speaker, a shimmering $200 polyhedron adorned with rose gold celestial shapes. Wolf's work has become so popular among fans of tabletop role-playing games, particularly avid Dungeons & Dragons players, that she has been able to turn what was once a hobby into a full-time job. She made the switch after she realized she was earning more money through dice making than in her former job as a part-time community college teacher. She was inspired to start crafting her own dice after watching online streams of D&D, then playing the game herself. Experiencing the game firsthand, in addition to watching it gave Wolf a newfound appreciation for those tiny geometric game accessories. Dice are so integral to not just the game, but the culture around the game, she says. And as I got more ingrained in the culture, destinies of functional personalities that populate it. Dice can feel like intimate, inanimate, palm-sized polyhedral grim reapers, guardian angels, or something in between, depending on how they fall. It's for these reasons that dice collections have become a point of pride for many D&D players, making it possible for Wolf and other independent dice collectors like her to make a business out of what started as a side project. Within the D&D community, there is much more importance associated with dice, like a fortune teller, almost like a fate kind of thing, says Ginny D, a popular YouTube personality who creates advice videos for tabletop players and Dungeon Masters DMs who narrate and write the story and facilitate gameplay during a session. As elaborate as dice have become, you can find dice that levitate, dice that are made of bone, dice that glow in the dark, and dice-filled flowers. They come from humble beginnings, and the early days of D&D, the 1980s, players colored in the numbers themselves. D&D games sold in the 1980s by DSR, the original publisher of D&D, even included a dice set with its own, complete with its own accompanying crayon. On Reddit, you'll find lengthy threads full of comments from veteran players who remember coloring in their own dice back in the day, along with remarks from modern players surprised by how drastically the world of dice has changed. Like some of these Redditors, Jeffrey Engelstein, an award-winning tabletop game designer who has published books on the subject and taught a board game design course at NYU. Game Center remembers Jeffrey Engelstein, a award-winning tabletop game designer who has published books on the subject and taught a board game design course at NYU Game Center, remembers the point in time as well. It was just intense on all sides for the numbers, and they were very hard to read, he said in reference to old school dice, so he used to rub them with crayons. Dice weren't always as intricate as they are today, but they always played a fundamental role in D&D. In fact, the rules for the original version of the game have a section explaining the different dice used in the game, prefaced with, "This is a very important section, please read carefully." Dice, whether they're physical or virtual, like ones available in the D&D Beyond app, decide everything that happens in the game. They determine whether your firebolt spell scorches your opponent, how much of a discount you'll get on that shiny long sword as you haggle with a local blacksmith, whether you discover the loot hidden in the cave you just explored, and how the tavern barmaiden responds to your flirtatious one-liners. It's probably easier to list the parts of D&D that don't require a dice roll, as because in a game as vast and broad as this, dice have the very important job of guiding the way for both players and DMs. You need these sorts of prompts, those abilities to narrow down this sort of potential randomness that anything in the world could possibly happen, says Sydney Engelstein, Jeffrey's daughter, who also designs tabletop games and happens to have a massive dice collection. It's always been not just a game mechanic, but also a kind of DM crutch to help guide the story, which is so open-ended. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when dice transitioned from utilitarian game pieces to reverent trinkets, but the modern fixation on dice happens to coincide with D&D's more prevalent role in today's pop culture. The main characters from the Netflix hit series Stranger Things, which was the most streamed show in 2022 according to Nielsen, heavily references D&D. Vecna, the main antagonist from the show's most recent season, is also the name of a villainous being in D&D lore. D&D has even spawned its own new style of entertainment through popular web series like Critical Role and Dimension 20. Critical Role started as a group of voice actor friends who would broadcast their hours-long sessions online, and had since flourished into a media company, complete with its very own animated series on Amazon Prime. Each week, millions of subscribers across YouTube and Twitch tune in to watch the story unfold and follow the shenanigans of the campaign's beloved characters, led by veteran Dungeon Master Matt Mercer. Dimension 20, hosted by independent comedy platform Dropout spin on D&D with a comedic twist. Spearheaded by writer, actor, and comedian Brennan Lee Mulligan, the show has gained such a fervent following that it scored a gig at Madison Square Garden and has sold out the venue with ticket prices skyrocketing to $2,000 a pop. These icons are just that, icons, says Scooby-Doo and Scream actor Matthew Lillard in reference to the casts of Critical Role and Dimension 20. Lillard, a seasoned D&D player, is the co-founder of Beetle and Grimm's Pandemonium Warehouse, which sells dice sets, premium D&D editions, and other tabletop merchandise. And so I think they're allowing this community to grow in leaps and bounds because they're bringing it to a passion, an incredible sense of gameplay. Critical Role and Dimension 20 have not just exposed D&D to a broader audience, they've proved that the game can still become something completely new and original even after 50 years. And that could be why there's been a newfound love of dice over the last decade too. Wolf says that dice makers will often make dice sets inspired by Critical Role characters or Dimension 20 seasons. Doug Christensen, who creates gemstone dice in his home and sells them under the brand Hedron Rockworks, attributes the increased interest in dice to a combination of factors including shows like Critical Role and Stranger Things and games like Baldur's Gate 3. As a new player, he says, being able to watch D&D through Critical Role made learning about and understanding the game much more approachable. I had wanted to play forever, but it was always this daunting thing, he says. I didn't know people who were playing, and I didn't know how. So being able to see people through live streaming, I think it was a big part of it. Social media is also likely has a lot to do with the dice renaissance, allowing anyone to marvel at handmade creations, whether they plan to purchase them or not. Instagram and YouTube have been particularly lucrative for attracting shoppers, according to Wolf, although she notes that social media can be fickle. Christensen says he found himself scrambling to keep up with demand when a couple of Instagram reels showing off his work went viral. As the selection of dice has expanded, so have the ways in which players use them. While not all players are fascinated by dice, some have just as much fun pressing a button in an app. Others use them to relate to their characters. That's certainly the case for Lillard, who uses different sets of dice depending on the character he's playing. Each character has different mannerisms, personalities, and expressions, and dice are one way in which those attributes manifest during the game. You can spend thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on this hobby, he says, but the dice are an easy access to express yourself at the table, and each character is a different expression. Ginny D goes a step beyond just having different sets of dice for specific characters. After creating what she refers to as a dice palette for character, she'll sometimes swap out pieces to align with a character's development throughout the campaign. One such example includes a deep gnome barbarian character that started out as a mushroom farmer. She began the story using dice that had tiny mushrooms inside them as a nod to the character's origin, but after 2 or 3 years, it was time to update the dice with something more fitting, much like the way a character's wardrobe might evolve over the course of a television show. As storylines and personalities change, it's a fitting comparison for D, considering she started out as a cosplayer and costume maker before creating D&D-oriented videos. It makes no real difference to my gameplay, certainly not mechanically, she said, but it helps keep me connected to the character. An affinity for dice doesn't have to be character-driven. Some players collect dice simply because gathering a wide variety of different shapes, sizes, and colors is a way to commemorate their love of the game. A photo of Sydney Engelston's dice went viral on the social media platform X, or Twitter, perhaps a sign that people just love admiring impressive collections, which apparently was what this was. When she's not showcasing the 10-year collection, Sydney Engelstein keeps her dice in crafting drawers. That is a huge collection. Really, colors of the rainbow-y as well. I love it. Now, dice also allow portion of it is really big for the whole machine of D&D, said Christensen. Not just the dice, but the dice tray, the cups that you're drinking out of, the scenery you're playing on. As beloved as dice may be for some players, they can also present an element of betrayal. Using your favorite dice doesn't guarantee your favorite outcome, and some players are superstitious about their dice for that exact reason. As much as he loves his dice, Lillard said, he has no problem tossing one back in the pile if it's not rolling the desired results. But that's part of the beauty of D&D. It's not up to the player or the DM, but the dice. Sydney Engelstein recalls one such example from a friend's campaign. When a player reaches 0 hit points in D&D, they are required to roll saving throws to revive their character from unconsciousness. After a certain number of saving throws, the character is considered dead and is no longer playable in the game, barring a costly resurrection spell. In this particular example, the DM kept coming up with excuses to provide more rolls, but the player failed even after 6 attempts. While it wasn't the desired outcome, the story took a wonderfully surprising turn because of it. You have this literal random number generator that could throw a wrench into things, Engelstein says, and you get to see the way the story bends. Perhaps creating, collecting, and curating dice is the player's way of offsetting the randomness they can represent in D&D. For better or worse, there's no controlling how the dice fall, but players can use them to control how they represent the characters and themselves at the table. It's a talisman, says Lillard. It's a way to load that into that character, and it's something that becomes as important as the adventure itself. So we have Dreamy Dice is a one-person operation crafting unique sets above. Below right, YouTuber Jenny D advises players and dungeon masters. The video game link. D&D has influenced gaming from the start, and gaming in turn has helped inspire changes to D&D. By Daniel Howley. Baldur's Gate 3 2023 was a D&D style adventuring party, each with their own official combat class and backstory. So here we have Cyberpunk's 2077's futuristic Night City left. Right here. Distills fundamentals from D&D above. Dragon Quest II 1987. This neon-drenched city is under siege, sprinting down a back alley looking for any kind of refuge. I freeze as a group of tiger claws steps out from the shadows. The gleam of the light off their raised katanas proves I've crossed into the wrong neighborhood, and they're itching for a fight. Tick, tick, tick. My health points drop slowly at first, then steadily, but I'm prepared for this. My armor bonuses keep the worst of the gang members' blows from getting through. The digital dice rolling invisibly in the background fall in my favor, and I manage to fend off the attack, earning some new gear and experience points in the process. No, I'm not actually prowling the streets of Night City. Rather, I'm lounging comfortably on my couch, controlling the character V from the video game Cyberpunk 2077. And while it might seem unlikely, the scenario I just experienced, and countless others in games you have played throughout the years, was made possible thanks to Dungeons and Dragons. Wizardry, Final Fantasy, The Last of Us, Call of Duty, each game takes key principles from Dungeons and Dragons. So many of these fundamental ways we think about making games actually come from D&D, explains Sam Roberts, Assistant Director of the Interactive Media and Games Division at the University of South Carolina School of Cinematic Arts. Levels, experience points, hit points. This stuff is all in D&D first. The way that D&D simulates the world through numbers is basically pervasive throughout modern video game design. V's health. In my encounter with the Tiger Claws, his armor, the gear I picked up after my fight, all of that is based on ideas established by a half-century-old tabletop game. Perhaps the best representation of this fusion of D&D and video games is Baldur's Gate 3, the winner of multiple Games Awards, Game of the Year Awards in 2023. It perfectly translates the world of D&D into a 3D landscape that students Gary Whisenant and Ray Wood began developing a game based on the role-playing game for the Plato computer system, a rudimentary computer by today's standards. The Plato system was a large computer with its own room in SIU's library. Originally developed for educational purposes, Plato featured early versions of email messaging and network connectivity via telephone lines that allowed the computers to talk to other Plato systems at participating universities. According to Whisenant, other students had developed a D&D style game named Pettit 5 or The Dungeon, but administrators deleted the title because it was unauthorized software. Because Whisenant had administrative privileges for the Plato computer at SIU, he and Wood could build their own D&D style game and keep it up and running without interruption. They named it, what else? D&D. Despite its relatively basic look, character designs that lacked depth, and dungeons that were simply hallways made up of individual lines, the game is notable for introducing the notion of boss fights into video games, giving players one final challenge before wrapping up their quest. We wanted the game to have something big at the end, Whisenant says. And so, when you have monsters and creatures and stuff, it's like, well, you need a super monster here of some kind, right? A number of similar titles inspired by tabletop game followed suit, including 1981's Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, one of the most successful early Dungeons & Dragons styles games. Wizardry required players to form their own party of 6 adventurers and traverse a 10-floor maze to face off against the Wizard of Werdena. The game included mechanics like armor classes, spells, and character stats like strength and stamina, and while it might not be visually stunning compared to today's games, it managed to hook players at the time. Wizardry helped spark the imagination of a generation of early video game developers. There were a lot of creators at the time in the early 80s who were thinking, gee, this D&D stuff is pretty cool. How could you make a video game out of it? Explains Dan Rawson, Senior Vice President of Dungeons & Dragons at Wizards of the Coast. The first video game I played was on the Apple IIe Wizardry. My dad brought home Wizardry, and I thought, holy smokes, this is D&D with the little green lines. Pioneering game developer Yuji Horii also took inspiration from D&D and Wizardry and created the ultimate recipe for video game role-playing games. Dragon Quest, released in 1986 in Japan and in the US in 1989, where it was localized as Dragon Warrior Dragon Quest, follows the story of a young hero as he works to defeat the evil Dragon Lord. The quintessential Japanese role-playing game Dragon Quest inspired a vast range of developers to build their own games, including Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, who credits Dragon Quest for influencing the long-running role-playing series, to Elden Ring developer Hidetaka Miyazaki, who cites Dragon Quest as one of the games that led him to develop his punishingly difficult Souls series of titles. Dragon Quest is so hugely influential, says Washington Post video game critic Gene Park. There are so many games that take from it. Dungeons & Dragons didn't just influence role-playing games, though. The 1996 first-person shooter Quake was initially envisioned as a 3D role-playing title based around a non-player character from developer John Carmack's Dungeons & Dragons campaign. An all-powerful warrior, the character appropriately named Quake, was supposed to wield a Thor-like hammer of thunderbolts and a ring of regeneration. But the technological challenges of building a game engine while attempting to create such an ambitious game forced the team to change course. D&D to 3D. Throughout the years, video games have evolved from the simple 2D lines of D&D to the bright, friendly sprites of Final Fantasy to the hyper-realistic 3D models you see in titles like Cyberpunk. Despite gaming getting a visual facelift through, though many of the concepts codified in D&D continue to permeate spells or choosing a subclass for your D&D character each time you reach a new level. The Witcher 3, Starfield, Horizon Zero Dawn, Pokemon, Halo, Hades, all modern game franchises, despite their genres, have taken bits and pieces from D&D. Any game that involves combat can trace roots from the tabletop game played with notebooks in hobby shops and dorm rooms across the globe. I think that especially how D&D handles combat was really powerful because it turned into an algorithm, says Hammer. Multiplayer online games in particular capture one of the most important details of D&D, working together with other players. D&D's system of classes is made up of various healers, fighters, ranged attackers, and spellcasters. Each of those help to balance the others out. Without healers, fighters will die. Without spellcasters, healers can't defend from other casters and fighters. The idea is tightly bound to games like World of Warcraft, League of Legends, and Battlefield. In D&D, right, you've got your rogues and your wizards. If you look at MMOs or massive online battle areas, MOBAs, you start to see that abstracted into what we might call the tank. Damage per second, healer, triangle. Hammer explains. It comes back to this same idea that can really comes from Dungeons & Dragons as a social game experience. One of the best examples of D&D's influence on modern games comes from Baldur's Gate 3. The follow-up to Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2 takes place in the D&D universe, but that's not why it's such an excellent illustration of D&D's influence on gaming. It's the way Baldur's Gate 3 captures that kind of emergent narratives that develop naturally in D&D and allow players to create their own unique experiences on every playthrough. It proves it's the progeny of tabletop games. See a suspicious cow, take a potion of animal speaking to find out what's up with that befuddling bovine. Bypass a character in a trap early on in the game, you'll have a completely different playthrough than someone who saved them. From having to roll a d20 to die, to understanding how terrain affects your movement. Baldur's Gate 3 is not merely influenced by D&D, it's D&D distilled into its most potent form in a 3D world. Every move you make is pure D&D. Each time you enter a battle in the game, you roll initiative to see if you and your party or your enemies attack first. Your weapons have a base damage amount that's then modified by dice rolls depending on whether the item does some kind of elemental damage. Encounters with non-player characters are determined by how well you roll and whether your character has enough charisma or perception. Even the way you interact with your in-game party members is meant to evoke the feeling of playing alongside your friends in a game of tabletop D&D. Baldur's Gate was probably the quintessential digital representation of D&D 5th edition, says Dan Ayub, Vice President and Head of Game Studios at Wizards of the Coast. I think those core principles that D&D represents and those core mechanics that are getting translated into gameplay are so universal, lend themselves so well to video games in this style of play that people will come in and then stay. Baldur's Gate 3 and its predecessors aren't the only official D&D games out there. There have been several official D&D partnered games, including the highly regarded Neverwinter Nights and the Icewind Dale series, but Baldur's Gate 3 managed to capture the essence of D&D in such an approachable package that it became a runaway success, winning awards, acclaim, and praise from D&D players and newcomers alike. Video games to D&D and back. As video games have evolved through the years, creators structure and a more accessible entry point for newer players. The power cards literally told players how to use their individual class actions, ensuring they could quickly and easily access them during a session. This kind of interactivity, similar to context menus in video games, helped streamline the playing process, and while the 4th edition was banned by some, it's seen somewhat of a resurgence in the years since it was released in 2008. The 4th edition also carried a deeper sense of collaboration between players that was born out of the kind of class balance developed in games like EverQuest, which themselves were inspired directly by D&D. That has flown heavily back into tabletop role-playing games, says Roberts. D&D and most of the stuff like it is you play with your friends and everybody has to take on a role. And that actually is the influence of video games back into the format. Beyond certain gameplay mechanics and styles, D&D has gained another important element from video games: new players. Titles like Baldur's Gate 3 have helped expand D&D's audience, giving gamers a grander sense of what a campaign looked like from a person explaining it over a card table ever could. I think you see a natural progression of people from D&D into video games, and I think that's what's fabulous now, is you're seeing it go the other way. Abe says, I'm just seeing many stories of people who have never played the pen and paper D&D game getting into it because they've played video games like Baldur's Gate 3. And here we have, during a combat encounter in Baldur's Gate 3, players have the same action economy as in D&D, with a choice of various spells and attacks. The many partnerships. Dungeons & Dragons has forged all sorts of cool, unique, and bizarre collaborations over its 50-year history. Here are some of the standouts. By Ava Erickson. Monopoly, a tabletop-themed tabletop game. Launched in 2021, D&D Monopoly joined the ranks of other themed monopolies like Hello Kitty, Beetlejuice, and even RuPaul Monopoly to let players buy, sell, and mortgage their way through their favorite fictional worlds. While it's a little unclear exactly how you build a hotel on a goblin, the game seems to be a hit, garnering a 4.8-star rating on Amazon. Converse sneakers, first launched as a 2024 Gary Coleman. The Converse line celebrates D&D's 50-year history with vintage illustrations from the game, including Zarek the Assassin from the 1983 supplement, The Shady Dragon Inn, and Warduke from the beloved 80s cartoon. Candles. It turns out that sorcerers smell like sandalwood and cedar. Wizards emit a patchouli and geranium scent, and monks have more of an oak moss and amber aroma. That is, according to Tabletop Candle Company, a small business that created a line of D&D candles. Lego set. When Lego and D&D enthusiast Lucas Bolt submitted his fan design to one of Lego's building challenges, he was a shoo-in for the grand prize. Lego soon launched a set to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D&D, largely inspired by his design. Complete with a tower, giant red dragon, and even a gelatinous cube, the set includes 3,745 pieces and retails for $359.99. Pop-Tarts. Bards and wizards can cast a funny spell that makes the creature of their choice fall into uncontrollable fits of laughter. To cast the spell, players need 2 key ingredients: tiny tarts and a feather that's waved in the air. In 2020, Pop-Tarts decided to adopt one of these ingredients, offering up Tasha's hideous laughter-themed Pop-Tarts in a frosty goodberry flavor. Subscription box. For $40 a month, D&D fans can receive a subscription box that the company Dragon's Nest Delivery promises will satisfy your dice goblin heart. The boxes come with a set of dice. You can never have too too many dice, minis, snacks, and downloadable materials to keep your campaign going. D20 backpack. Nothing screams D&D more than a 20-sided die, and this D&D backpack takes it to the next level. While the shape may be a bit cumbersome, customers love it. You kidding me? Worth every penny, wrote one reviewer on Amazon. Master Cookbook. How to host the best D&D campaign ever. Charm your players with food, of course. Written by Jeff Aldridge and John Taylor, hosts of the role-playing game review podcast System Mastery. The Dungeon Meister Cookbook promises to deliver easy-to-follow meals inspired by D&D, like the Mimic Munchies, Cookie Monsters complete with cherry airhead tongues and mini marshmallow teeth. Vacation Spot. Since 2018, D&D in a Castle has been hosting 4-day immersive trips. They could run over $5,000 and include a stay in a D&D themed castle and 8 hours of gameplay with D&D pros every day. Aloha Shirt. In commemoration of the 50th anniversary, D&D collabed with classic Aloha Shirt brand Ryan Spooner. The print features 6 scenes representing each of the abilities. For example, for charisma, the party is shown at the Yawning Portal Tavern enjoying beer and sharing stories of their adventure. Whiskey. One of the latest additions to the arsenal of celebrity liquors is Matthew Lillard's D&D themed whiskey Quest's End. A lifelong D&D player, Lillard launched the Paladin flavor first, as paladins have strong conviction. We feel the same way about this company, the idea of building stuff for fandoms, he has said. Stamps. Even the U.S. Postal Service decided to get on board with the celebration of D&D's 50th anniversary, launching a collection of 10 D&D themed stamps. Designed by USPS art director Greg Breeding using existing illustrations, the stamps depict popular characters and iconic art. Engagement Ring. For the most passionate D&D players, Rixon Jewelry offers themed engagement rings. For one of them, the diamond, which can be any stone including a genuine diamond, is hugged by 2 mini D20s. All D&D couples need now is a ceremony spell to seal the deal. Chapter 4. Healing Words. Gathering with friends to roleplay challenges and victories has been a powerful medium in both casual and clinical settings. A classic action hero archetype, the fighter class in D&D 5th edition, is a potent damage-dealing character creation option. Therapy and play. Psychologists and researchers have found that playing Dungeons & Dragons can be an effective way to treat mental health conditions. By Ashley Abramson. What comes to mind when you think of a psychotherapy session? You might picture an awkward conversation with a complete stranger who takes notes as you air your most personal problems. Or perhaps you picture yourself lying on a couch while an intimidating onlooker analyzes your every word. What if, instead of traditional therapy, you could slay dragons alongside your therapist, working through your struggles, processing your emotions, and working towards your mental health goals as a character in a game? As tabletop role-playing games, TTRPGs, like Dungeons & Dragons have skyrocketed in popularity over the past several years, therapists and psychologists have turned to game therapy groups as a way to explore real-life problems without potential discomforts of a one-on-one counseling session. Building on experimental modalities like art, music, and animal-assisted therapy, gaming as therapy allows participants to work on their mental health in an environment that feels safe and even fun. Although there are no randomized controlled trials that prove the method's efficacy and suggest the best ways to use it, therapists who incorporate TTRPGs in treatment say they're seeing great success with the approach, and that the premise is a great way to reduce harmful stigmas around therapy and help more people improve their mental health. Breaking stigmas. Stigmas driven by misunderstandings about mental illness and its treatments are often one of the biggest barriers preventing people from seeking out professional support. Making therapy fun, and especially incorporating games that people are familiar with or want to learn how to play, can encourage people who might not otherwise consider seeing a mental health professional. It gives people an in to the mental health field without it being scary, says therapist Charlene McPherson, founder of Nerd Adventure Therapy, 20 in Baltimore. Some clients, McPherson says, want to see a therapist and find the non-traditional setup more comfortable. Others come to her D&D therapy group simply as a safe, non-judgmental place to learn how to play the game. Here we have, while conquering fears and traumas can be hard, channeling that work into defeating a dragon can help growth feel more achievable. Charlene McPherson, a therapist in the Baltimore area, uses nerdy and pop culture interests to help her clients make sense of the world. Because Dungeons & Dragons is, by nature, a collaborative group game, it lends itself most effectively to therapy groups, ranging from 2 to 7 or 8 people. Typically, general therapy groups led by a therapist with several participants are useful for finding a supportive community and teaching people skills to help with issues such as anxiety, depression, and neurodivergent conditions like ADHD, autism. In any group, people can work on their therapy goals and practice them in real time with feedback from other members and the therapist. But therapists say it's notoriously difficult to get people to come to groups. Showing up to therapy and being vulnerable in front of others can feel intimidating, especially if someone is already struggling with low motivation from depression or has social anxiety. Framing it as a gaming therapy group can help, says psychologist Megan Connell, author of Tabletop Role-Playing Therapy, a guide or clinician game master. Many therapists who use TTRPGs adopt a more casual approach. McPherson is a self-proclaimed nerd who has blue hair and regularly wears t-shirts in therapy, which also helps create a safe space for people who might feel nervous about opening up to a therapist. In either case, McPherson says many group attendees start out hesitant to pursue individual therapy, but after attending their group a few times, they're also open to and even excited about the prospect of one-on-one talk therapy sessions that don't involve the game. It's like hiding the therapeutic pill in the game cheese, says William Nation, a staff psychologist at Johns Hopkins University who leads Dungeons & Dragons therapy groups. Gamifying growth. The structure of Dungeons & Dragons is especially conducive to helping people because therapists can create stories that challenge the characters and help them grow based on their individual needs. Nation and his co-facilitator, for example, meet with college student clients prior to placing them in a group to learn about their symptoms and goals, along with providing them with the resources they need to understand and play the game like books and dice. The storyline and gameplay vary based on the needs of the clients and the expertise of the therapists. As part of her intake assessment, McPherson helps clients create characters with backstories and traits that align with their therapy goals, then creates the entire campaign to integrate everyone in the group. During the actual game, the therapist plays the dungeon master, narrating the game and setting up opportunities to challenge characters in the environment that feels safer or less intimidating than processing feelings or practicing skills in real life. McPherson describes it as a microcosm of society, where people can try new things without fear of real-world consequences. In a role-playing game, when you're playing an amazing wizard, you have a once-removed distance from your problems that helps you see them differently, says Connell. You can see your struggles in a different light and understand what's going on without defense mechanisms getting in the way of healing. Therapists can easily adjust the story as needed when something's not working, or someone needs a new challenge. Connell appreciates the ability to introduce new obstacles that elicit a particular response and ultimately help the clients practice skills they want to grow in. On the flip side, if things are feeling too intense, the therapist can scale back as needed to prevent overwhelming the client. This is especially helpful, McPherson says, when a client has experienced trauma. The goal is to help them practice new skills to cope with their symptoms, not to re-traumatize them. Most of McPherson's clients are neurodivergent adults who identify as women or non-binary. she uses the game to help them gain new skills to navigate the world with brain differences like autism or ADHD. Neurodivergent people like to do things creatively, and the real world often tells us, no, do it this way, McPherson says. Allowing players to come up with and play out their own awesome ideas gives them a confidence boost. For players who struggle with anxiety, the game can provide opportunities to learn about speaking up for oneself or overcoming fears. For example, Nation says his college-age participants sometimes want to work on having difficult conversations with others, even to express romantic interest, which can feel high stakes for someone with anxiety or neurodivergence. Setting a boundary or expressing a need between characters in a game usually feels less stressful than doing it in real life. Maybe it goes badly, but hopefully the person gets insight or at least practice that helps them feel more comfortable in new situations, Nation says. Role-playing is also helpful for addressing negative thinking patterns that can affect people with depression. If a battle is going poorly or a player isn't doing well, McPherson usually addresses their negative comments and encourages them to reframe the situation more positively or ask for support. The quote says, for players who struggle with anxiety, the game can provide opportunities to learn about speaking up for oneself or overcoming fears. She also sometimes encourages players to practice supporting or encouraging another character who's feeling depressed, so they can practice helpful self-talk techniques that translate to real life. Players can also create monsters that represent their mental illness, so they can converse about what it looks like to fight their anxiety or depression, and then apply the concept to their everyday lives. One of my clients made a gelatinous cube monster to represent depression, because it envelops you when you feel heavy and slow, says Connell. Together with other players, they realized it was easier to fight if you have other people rallying with you to help you move. Therapists often address improving social skills in groups too, and not just between players. Connell says the game can help people, especially those with autism, think about what their character would want to do in a given situation, rather than what they'd want to do in real life. Maybe the player wants to upgrade weapons, but the original weapon belonged to the character's father. The player could take the character's perspective and gain empathy starting the game. At the end of the group gameplay, which often lasts up to 90 minutes, therapists usually take time to process the session with players so they can gain insight about themselves and how they want to grow. Connell's practice focuses on helping women and girls from middle school and adulthood learn how to communicate assertively while supporting and cooperating with other women. Recently, she set up a game where the group members had to work together and to collect valuable item. But she put multiple copies of the item in the game. After the goal had been achieved, one player wanted to get an extra copy of the item for themselves, which would risk the success of the mission. The group faced conflict, where some clients started shutting down and not voicing their feelings. We talked about how our actions can affect other people, but also how we respond to conflict and how we can better resolve it, Connell says. McPherson likes to meet separately with individual clients after group game sessions to process the gameplay and recognize the ways they're working on goals. She says it's often easier to dig deeper privately without being in front of other people. They start to realize the game isn't just fun, but they're working on their goals and they're starting to do it outside of the group, she says. Some therapists pursue formal training about how to effectively integrate TTRPGs into therapy. Groups like Geek Therapeutics or Game to Grow provide continuing education hours and certification for therapists and other behavioral health providers, offering insights on logistics like how to bill insurance for gameplay sessions and therapeutic skills such as helping clients create characters that will help them build emotional insight. Other therapists simply integrate their own background and interest in the games into their therapeutic expertise. A bright future. Until there are double-blind studies researching gaming and therapy, mental health providers are relying on case studies and research from adjacent therapies like art, drama, and music therapy. We're still exploring the best and most efficient ways to use games and what can and can't be done, says Nation, as long as the therapist is confident Therapists can also use TTRPGs like D&D in therapy for people with more serious mental illnesses such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and even in settings that serve at-risk youth or people with eating disorders. It's not limited to therapy either. At Johns Hopkins, Nation and his co-facilitators also lead a non-therapy D&D workshop where students can play parts in a story written in line with learning and objectives we want people on campus to learn about. Dungeons & Dragons is a particularly easy game to use in therapy. Therapists agree. Along with its versatility in therapeutic settings, it has large fan base and name recognition. It's easily accessible and relatively simple to learn, but D&D isn't the only TTRPG game therapists can use. There are thousands of styles of RPGs for therapists to experiment with to better cater to their clients' needs and interests. So far, Connell says role-playing games seem to be limitless in their potential for helping people address personal growth goals, whether it's dealing with mental health symptoms, gaining confidence, or building community. In one recent D&D game, a group of Connell's youth clients worked together to fight off a dragon. Once Connell narrated that the dragon was slain, everyone in the table burst into tears. They all jumped up and hugged each other, she says. One of them said, "Look what I can do when I'm with my friends. I can slay dragons. I can do anything." Here we have suffocating and all-encompassing. A battle with a gelatinous cube is an apt metaphor for a client's struggle with depression. The magic of D&D can save us. A game designer on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition shares her journey with role-playing games and the power of playing pretend by Kate Welch. Here we have The Ghosts of Saltmarsh. The source book offers a toolkit for ocean adventures. I became aware of Dungeons & Dragons at the same instant that I was made to believe that D&D was maybe not for me. In 2003, I was working in a coffee shop in a small North Carolina town. College and I hadn't gotten along, and I didn't have anything close to a 5-year plan. The boys who sat in the back of the shop ordered nothing but water for hours, and stopped talking only when I delivered it to them, giving me the distinct impression that whatever secret conversations they were having, I wasn't welcome. It took me weeks to even realize that what they were doing was playing D&D. I'm pretty sure they thought I'd make fun of them for it. We've all heard the stories, seen the shows, and watched the movies where the nerds got beat up for their hobbies. Many, particularly men, cling to this experience like a trophy. If you weren't persecuted in the 80s for your interest in Star Wars and D&D, you haven't really suffered for the love. Perhaps not, but D&D at its very core is a game that you have to play with other people. It's a game that requires the intimacy that comes with community. Simply put, you had to have at least one friend as nerdy as you to play. Growing up as a self-described nerdy girl, I often felt invisible and excluded from my interests, even by the nerdy guys around me, and I was exceptionally lonely as a result, so I know how these boys in the coffee shop felt. I'd been a devoted Star Wars role-player in online chat rooms since I was 13. It wasn't a hobby you shared with folks, it was something you hid. Besides, neither the world of Dungeons nor Dragons particularly lit me up. The game had a heavy metal vibe to it, a magazine I appreciate as an adult, but one that I suspect was not aimed to appeal to young women and girls. At the time, it seemed to me that D&D was almost certainly about wielding huge swords. Meh. Killing dragons. Or carrying barefooted damsels over your shoulder. Woof. I was fine with my story-driven Star Wars chat room dramas, thank you very much. It was only years later, around 2010, that I saw Acquisitions Incorporated on the main stage at the Penny Arcade Expo, PAX, in Seattle. For the uninitiated, Acquisitions Incorporated is a D&D party that stars the creators of the Penny Arcade webcomic, and whoever they can talk into sharing a stage with them while they play hilarious games of D&D. These 5 dorky, lovable dudes played D&D in front of a packed theater and brought the house down. Until then, I doubt anyone thought of this hobby as having entertainment value. In fact, until then, I didn't realize what D&D actually was. newest stories, and I had to play it. Hearing about other people's D&D games is like hearing about a dream they had. It sounds like complete nonsense to you when you're not sure why they're telling you about it. I wasn't going to put you through it, but my editor for this piece says I should, so picture it. A party of adventurers pauses at the edge of a cliff, taking a moment to deserved rest, when suddenly the clicking of massive insect legs boils up over the precipice. Giant spiders, with dragon mayor holler, Cookie Crisp, my dwarf barbarian, Maxis, Destinax, jumps into the fray. I roll a natural 20 on the die, a critical success. Maxis jumps on the back of the spider and rides it down the slope of the cliff, splitting it apart with her axe, until it slides gently to a halt safely at the bottom. See what I mean? Dreadful. But when talking about it further made me learn what D&D felt like, since that first exposure in the coffee shop and later at the Penny Arcade Expo. I have clocked hundreds of hours of D&D both as a player and as a dungeon master, running the game. In 2017, Acquisition Incorporated invited me to be on their weekly streamed D&D show for several years, and I made some of the best friends of my life. I joined Wizard of the Coast, who have published the game since 1997, to become the first female game designer on D&D's 5th edition. Here we have a D&D party exists in both the collective imagination as adventurers, the players personify, and in person as the players come together to tell a story. Interesting, we've got like a bar vibe with people around tables, around maps, with wanted posters for old pieces. People rather close to one another. Another person playing music. A cat. A bartender. Even, or a shopkeeper maybe, even reading from a book. I like that the artist's signature is incorporated into the wood of the table. Now, to finish off what it says, I've run games for all kinds of people. Young and old, strangers and friends, old-timers and novices. What I've found is that something mystical happens when you give yourself permission to play pretend. Being vulnerable and creative is a huge part of it. You must trust and be trusted with what it feels like subjective foolishness, but when you add elements of collective imagination and improvisation, you create a strange alchemy that inscribes pathways in your brain, tangible as the memories of real life, even though it lives solely in the minds of a select few. Those pathways bond you in ways that no one else can understand. D&D and other tabletop role-playing games, RPGs, are being used across the world as a learning tool in classrooms and even as an effective form of therapy. I started playing on the C Team, the Acquisitions Incorporated weekly livestream show with 4 people I barely knew, as debilitating as it can be to play improvised pretend fantasy in front of a few others cooperating adults. It's beyond overwhelming to do so in front of hundreds of onlookers. I was terrified, but what I didn't expect is that bond that typically extends out to your table mates spread throughout the community of fans who witnessed the story alongside us. Our campaign was personalized in the imagination of each individual who followed the show, adding to and bolstering the tapestry of storytelling before us. Letting go of inhibitions about playing pretend is difficult. Letting people in is perhaps even more so. People might think we're childish if we play pretend. They might make fun of us, laugh us out of our coffee shops. I do understand, but you see, I have witnessed so much magic from people shaking it off, those inhibitions to weave stories together for themselves. And doesn't that matter so much more? Maybe magic can't save us, but unless it's an evocation spell, it certainly can't hurt. And here we have the character sheet is both a building block of roleplay and gateway into new realms. By documenting their unique game mechanics, players are then given freedom to improvise. And then here we have the credits. We have a picture here. It says, draconic ancestry, they have an elemental breath weapon that also provides a damage resistance. I like this, like, dragonborn bard here, influencing this person in the bar, in the tavern. And of course we have all of the different credits, which is great, including all of the photo credits, which, awesome. I'm glad that there are more photo credits there. I just wish that they also had the small text on the photos themselves, like in the corner or something. But that's okay. It's all copyright 2024 and it's pretty good. I got one more page. Draconic measures. The unique lore and abilities of the titular D&D creature have remained consistent throughout the franchise by Courtney Mifsud and Tregelia. I still don't know how to pronounce that name, I'm sorry. Smart and charming. All true dragons in D&D are depicted as intelligent and charismatic. Those dragons aligned with evil are quick to attack any adventurers. But there are some good dragons who might engage in a bit of diplomacy before they resort to bloodshed. Breath weapons. Each type of dragon has a different breath weapon, a cone or line-shaped element-based attack exhaled by them. Red and gold dragons breathe fire, blue and bronze dragons breathe lightning, and white and silver dragons exhale frosty cold damage. We have flight speeds. In D&D, dragons can dash, climb, and most importantly, fly. An adult red dragon has a fly speed of 80 feet, or 160 feet per round, if it takes the dash action. But its wings are not just for soaring. Dragons can use their appendages for an attack that bludgeons enemies. Hoards and lairs. Dragons are notoriously covetous, hoarding their mountains of treasure within their lairs. If players tried to pilfer gold from a sleeping dragon's stash, they will likely have to endure rounds of challenging lair actions, including earthquakes and rocky fissures. Really like the blue, orange, red, and gold in the wings, tails, and just overall in the dragon along with that red. It's really nice. I like how detailed it is. And we have our various days design on the back cover as well. And the back, speaking of back cover, 20-sided stories. The limitless adventures of Dungeons & Dragons began with a roll of the dice 50 years ago, and the journeys have only grown more extraordinary since. Through many imaginations, D&D has adapted and redefined itself, attracting millions of devotees from realms far and wide. I like this old school Dungeons & Dragons Dungeons Master Rules book with all the dice on there. But yeah, that's it. That's everything for this video.